This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 24 of the Naked Mormonism podcast. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Last episode was a little bit of a treat. I interviewed Caitlin McKenna, who was recently kicked out of her house for various reasons, the primary of which seemed to be disbelief in the church. Her GoFundMe page is doing fantastic in comparison to her initial goal, and I have a feeling that she is going to do just fine with the safety net that the secular community has woven for her to fall into. On behalf of myself and a few people that have emailed me concerning the interview, we all wish you the best of luck with constructing your new life, Caitlin, and, repairing the relationship between you and your parents. Thank you again so much for coming onto the show to share your story. As for last historical episode, we advanced the storyline a fair amount. We went from mid-September 1830 all the way to the beginning of 1831, with our focus on the westbound missionary force of the church. Before getting to this missionary force and talking about P-cubed Parley Parker Pratt, Orson Brainpower Pratt, and Dick Zybin Peterson, we started off the episode with a revelation that Joe gave, exclusively excusing the church from a huge recurring expense. It was the revelation that you can use anything liquid to symbolize the blood of Jesus during the sacrament ritual. It doesn't actually have to be wine as commanded before. If this revelation didn't exist, the church would necessarily have to buy barrels of wine to give to the congregants for every sacrament ceremony. Now they just use tap water and Wonder Bread and no wine and wafers like the Great and Abominable Church. After we talked about this specific revelation, we talked about Joe being persecuted in Harmony. Persecution that was probably at the behest of the same Methodist minister that would have counseled Joe and Emma once their first child died a few days after birth. This minister didn't like Joe, nor did he like Joe coming out with these new claims about Jesus and another New Testament of Jesus in America. So, the minister turned everybody in town, including the Hales, Joe's family-in-law, against Joe and the whole Mormon company that was running with him. Joe and company were effectively kicked out of Harmony, and Joe had to go back to Colesville to petition the help of an old friend, Sir Joseph Knight Sr. After this brief visit, Sir Joseph Knight came to Harmony with his wagon and moved Joe and friends from Harmony, Pennsylvania to Fayette, New York. When Joe arrived, the Fayette congregation was in complete disarray, with Ollie Cowdung, Oliver Cowdery running this shit show, Hiram Page giving inferior revelations about the location of Zion with an inferior stone and hat, and the entire Whitmer family once again turned against Joe, calling him a false prophet. Shit was officially pear-shaped, and Joe had to act fast to put out these fires or be consumed by them. The way he put out these fires was to quell each fire individually, using Joe's all-powerful, fire-quenching revelation. The second piece of the solution was removing the fire starter, Ollie. Fayette was the new official home base of the church until they would move out to Kirtland, Ohio in 1831, so Joe was pretty intent on getting it back under his control. I posited the hypothetical that maybe Joe and Ollie were in on the con together the whole time, and this was Joe's way of changing things from a partnership to a sole proprietorship. He effectively cut Ollie out of leadership and sent him over 1,000 miles away on a mission, so Joe could wrangle the church back into his control without Ollie there trying to constantly undermine the empire that Joe was constructing. In this hypothetical, Ollie would feel squashed and backstabbed and pushed around like just another one of Joe's bitches, and Joe probably would have felt like he couldn't trust Ollie to do his bidding anymore. Joe was the worst business partner ever, while Ollie was kind of a scheming snake in the grass that was trying to fuck Joe right out of the church before Joe could fuck him. Well, we know how that played out, and the after effect of this power struggle leaves us calling Joseph Smith the prophet of the church as opposed to Oliver Cowdery, which isn't so much the case for the RLDS church. Alright, that's enough roundup for today. Let's get into the topic of this episode. We're going to spend most of this episode focusing on the difference in character between Hingepin Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith. We've properly introduced Hingepin Rigdon in episode 14 and discussed the Solomon Spaulding manuscript found authorship theory, so if you want a refresher that will help with the content of this episode, I would recommend going back and listening to those episodes 14 and 15 before diving into this episode. That being said, disclaimers out of the way, let's talk about these two charisma-seeping fine young men. We're slowly coming to know the personality behind Joe. This portrait we're painting of him sets him up as an energetic, polarizing, outgoing, artistic dreamer type with a tendency to lie pathologically and deceive people out of their hard-earned money for his own living wage. Joe could tell a story, and if he caught you alone, he would be able to make you either believe everything he said or make you dislike his very nature as a habitual liar. This personality type has its place in building a cult, but it doesn't have all the necessary pieces. I've previously made the argument that in order to start up a cult or religious following, you need an idea man. That was Joe, and you need a businessman to help build the structure to perpetuate the idea that the dreamer had. Well, that role fell on Brigham Young, but he hasn't come up in our timeline yet, so we can ignore that for now. The third piece that Joe was in need of in order to construct the Church of Christ was a get-shit-doner. I flip-flop on the idea of whether this person was Ollie Cowdung or Hingepin Rigdon, but seeing all of the underhanded shit that Ollie was trying to pull on Joe, I'm beginning to lean more toward Rigdon being this magic third piece of the puzzle. Sidney Rigdon was a bit of a straight-laced, good-guy preacher that had a tendency to fall in and out of revelatory trances, possibly a product of a head injury as a young boy. Rigdon was one of the most vicious opposers to polygamy in the church when it was running rampant, and he would eventually struggle with this ethical conviction most when Joe tried to seduce his 19-year-old daughter, Nancy Rigdon. Hingepin Rigdon was different than Joe in a couple of striking ways. For one, Joe liked to party, while Rigdon was a bit more reserved. Joe had the ability to engage people one-on-one and was very persuasive in doing so, whereas Rigdon was a fantastic public speaker and the masses unequivocally loved him. Joe didn't mind speaking for God as his mouthpiece, and really, neither did Rigdon, but Rigdon did seem to have his eye on the long-term goal, while Joe was more of an eat, drink, and be merry type of guy. These differences were oddly complementary, especially in early 1831, which is where we're moving slowly. Like I said earlier, Joe needed a get-shit-doner, and Rigdon had done a lot of work before reportedly meeting Joe that would set himself up to fill this role very well. What's more than the role Rigdon filled was a massive second wind he gave the burgeoning church. Let's face it, the church for the 6 months leading up to late 1830 had been an out-of-control fucking train wreck. Joe was barely able to plug all the holes in the dam and put out all the fires that kept spawning each other. He was trying to run 3 different congregations spread out over a 200-mile radius with nothing but trouble from his second-in-command. Joe didn't have the infrastructure or the membership to continue doing this for much longer, which is one of the primary reasons he commissioned a Ziban P. Ollie and Peter Whitmer Jr. to spread the word and bring in new converts and consequently more tithing to build the empire with. The church would either spread out and consume more area and resources, or be completely snuffed out by this futile attempt to invade new territory. Well, the gamble worked, and this is where we start to run into a bit of conjecture and speculation. We have two competing theories to discuss, and the problem is that both are completely plausible to explain the evidence, and we'll be focusing on them for a while here. The first theory is that of complete ignorance of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon from Hingepin Sidney Rigdon's perspective, until the missionary force made it to his house in the late 1830. The opposing theory, on the other hand, posits that Joe and Rigdon had been in contact long before 1830, and that Rigdon had some hand in authoring the Book of Mormon using a manuscript that he found in his local printing press that was written by a man who had died nearly a decade before Rigdon found it. If you follow along with this show and the evidence that's been presented thus far, it's not hard to buy the latter theory, even though most scholars, believers and non-believers alike, tend to dismiss it for simple lack of evidence. Putting these theories aside, it doesn't really have a lot of bearing on the history itself. If Joe and Rigdon did know each other before, then the only detail that is added is the possibility that the church moving out to Ohio in 1831 was planned a long time before the missionary team got there in late 1830, and Rigdon was in on the con from the beginning. While that's entirely possible, the reported history states that Rigdon was completely ignorant of Joe and the Mormons until the missionary force got to him. This has absolutely zero bearing on whether or not the Book of Mormon is legitimate, or if Joe was scamming people to believe in his book or not. We don't need the manuscript that Rigdon allegedly stole in order to posit a possible source text for the Book of Mormon. Plenty of those exist outside of Solomon Spaulding. So it's completely possible that Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon did not know each other until late 1830 after the book was written. We don't need Rigdon to have colluded with Joe to get the church started, because Rigdon merely replaced Ollie as the get-shit-doner when Ollie became too cancerous to keep around. Simply put, the church could have easily been started and the Book of Mormon could have easily been written without the help of Hingepin Rigdon. So, I think the detail of Joe and Rigdon knowing each other before 1830 doesn't too much matter, to be honest. I'm not just saying that to, alleviate any scholarly responsibility. I'm merely pointing out that it doesn't tend to have much of an effect on how true Mormonism is. It doesn't really matter if the Spaulding manuscript was used to author the Book of Mormon. The book is still false without having to be plagiarized. And of course, the book and religion have perpetuated because bad ideas tend to spread better than good ideas, and lies are sometimes more convenient than truth. So let's talk about what happened next in our timeline here. We need to keep the competing theories posed in mind when discussing how it all went down, but we're going to read an excerpt from the History of the Church, Volume 1, starting on page 120. Keep in mind, History of the Church was written by Joseph himself and is widely distributed by the church, so there's no calling it anti-Mormon. I'm going to read a fairly large portion of this and then give my commentary on it all along the way, so strap in for a bit of a long haul here. Starting on page 120, quote, "Immediately on receiving this revelation, preparations were made for the journey of the brethren therein designated to the borders of the Lamanites, and a copy of the revelation was given them." The revelation it's talking about there is the order to send the missionary force out to Jackson County. "They bade adieu to their brethren and friends, and commenced their journey, preaching by the way, and leaving a sealing testimony behind them, lifting up their voice like a trump in the different villages through which they passed. They continued their journey until they came to Kirtland, Ohio, where they tarried for some time, there being quite a number in that place and vicinity who believed their testimony, and came forward and obeyed the gospel. Among the number was Mr. Sidney Rigdon, and a large portion of the church over which he presided." End quote. Alrighty, so the troop of Mishies basically made a beeline from Fayette, New York to Kirtland, Ohio, where Hingepin Sidney Rigdon lived and preached Campbellite Christianity. According to the footnotes in this version of the history that I'm reading, he had a few other congregations aside from the Kirtland gathering. One of these congregations was in Mentor, Ohio. When we did our rigorous Rigdon examination in episode 14, we found out that he was running the preaching circuit through Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, and pretty much anywhere else that would take him in, and this tends to show a bit of a dichotomy between Rigdon's and Joe's personalities. Reportedly, the people that followed Rigdon absolutely loved him, and he had charisma and extroversion that drew people in to be mesmerized by his preaching antics. He was probably energetic and loud and could easily rile up a crowd, much like some preachers today that we might consider completely batshit by skeptical standards. So he was the perfect person to randomly join the fold of Mormonism at this time. Or, by the competing theory, this was the perfect time for Joe and Rigdon to implement their plan that they'd been hatching for quite some time. Let's continue on in the history of the church for a minute here. Quote, "Previous to this day, Elder Parley P. Pratt had been a preacher in the same church with Mr. Rigdon and resided in the town of Amherst, Lorain County in Ohio, and had been sent into the state of New York on a mission, where he became acquainted with the circumstances of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and was introduced to Joseph Smith Jr. and other members of the church. The belief that there were many in the church with him which he had formerly been united, who were honest seekers after truth, induced Elder Pratt, while on his journey to the West, to call upon his friends, and make known the great things which the Lord had brought to pass." End quote. So, P. Cubed here was actually a member of Rigdon's Campbellite congregation in Mentor, or might have been even in the leadership there, and Rigdon sent him on a mission to New York. During this mission, we found out from the autobiography of P. Cubed that Pratt magically felt inclined to disembark in Rochester and head down to Palmyra, where he met up with Hiram Smith, Joe's older brother. According to the aforementioned autobiography, nothing but the Spirit inclined P. Cubed to do this. In fact, according to his own account, he wasn't even on a mission from Rigdon. He was merely on his way through New York to go visit some family in the East. But the history of the church said in the last paragraph that Rigdon had sent P. Cubed on a mission, and he happened to run in the Book of Mormon by happen chance. What an odd coincidence. Or we could consider the claims of the opposing theory. If Rigdon and Joe had been planning something all along, P. Cubed could have been working as a messenger in this capacity. Rigdon could have sent him to meet up with Joe by any means necessary to find out what the Book of Mormon was all about, knowing that P. Cubed would bring back a copy and try to convert Rigdon. Then Rigdon would appear to sincerely convert, and would convert his entire congregation to Mormonism, and therefore establish the groundwork that the church desperately needed to flourish. If Rigdon and Joe were planning this the whole time, P. Cubed could have just been a tool in the situation. Or he could have been on the inside, deliberately relaying messages between Rigdon and Joe under the guise of missionary work. We'll dive deeper into the details of that once we finish reading from the history of the church. Back to it, quote, "The first house at which they called in the vicinity of Kirtland was Mr. Rigdon's, and after the usual salutations, they presented him with a Book of Mormon, stating that it was a revelation from God. This being the first time he had ever heard of or seen the Book of Mormon, he felt very much surprised at the assertion, and replied that he had the Bible, which he believed was a revelation from God, and with which he pretended to have some acquaintance. But with respect to the book they had presented him, he must say that he had considerable doubt. Upon this, they expressed a desire to investigate the subject and argue the matter, but he replied, 'No, young gentleman, you must not argue with me on the subject, but I will read your book, and see what claims it has upon my faith, and will endeavor to ascertain whether it be a revelation from God or not.' After some further conversation, they expressed a desire to lay the subject before the people, and requested the privilege of preaching in Mr. Rigdon's chapel, to which he readily consented. The appointment was accordingly published, and a large and respectable congregation assembled. Oliver Cowdery and Parley P. Pratt severally addressed the meeting. At the conclusion, Mr. Rigdon arose and stated to the congregation that the information they had that evening received was of an extraordinary character and certainly demanded their most serious consideration. And as the apostle advised his brethren to prove all things and hold fast to that which is good, so he would exhort his brethren to do likewise, and give the matter a careful investigation, and not turn against it without being fully convinced of its being an imposition, lest they should possibly resist the truth. End quote. If we place the theories of how the missionaries met Rigdon momentarily aside, this was extremely convenient for the missionaries. They went to Rigdon's house as their first stop in Ohio, gave him a Book of Mormon, asked if they could preach in his congregation, and then did so successfully under Rigdon's consent. And at the end of it, Rigdon even stood up and said, "Hey everybody, the things that these people are talking about are from an extraordinary character, and they certainly demand your most serious attention." So he was kind of priming the crowd to believe what he was starting to believe. So you may wonder why Rigdon would allow such a stunt. Well, I don't know, but it's worth examining. So let's finish up this passage from the history of the church, and we'll try to tackle everything as one big whole. Quote, "A few miles from Mr. Rigdon's home in Mentor at the town of Kirtland lived a number of the members of his church. They lived together and had all things common, from which circumstance has risen the idea that this was the case with the Church of Jesus Christ. To that place the elders immediately repaired and proclaimed the gospel unto them, with considerable success. For their testimony was received by many of the people, and 17 came forward in obedience to the gospel. While thus engaged, they visited Mr. Rigdon occasionally and found him very earnestly reading the Book of Mormon, praying to the Lord for direction, and meditating on the things he heard and read. And after a fortnight from the time the book was put into his hands, he was fully convinced of the truth of the work, by a revelation from Jesus Christ, which was made known to him in a remarkable manner, so that he could exclaim," this is now quoting Sidney Rigdon, "Flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto me, but my Father which is in heaven." Back to quoting the history of the church. Accordingly, he and his wife were both baptized into the Church of Christ, and together in those who had been previously admitted to baptism, made a little branch of the church in this section of Ohio of about 20 members. This much accomplished, the brethren, bound for the borders of the Lamanites, bade an affectionate farewell to the saints in Kirtland and vicinity, and, after adding one of their new converts to their number, Dr. Frederick G. Williams, they went on their way rejoicing. End quote. All right, that's the end of this passage. The rest of the missionary's journey isn't quite as impactful or memorable as this few-week-long period in Ohio and New York with Joe and Rigdon, so let's focus on the more interesting stuff. Let's address the competing theories here. Let's try and knock it down to brass tacks. Like I said before reading this passage, it doesn't really have any sort of impact on the truthfulness of the Mormon religion, whether or not Rigdon and Joe were in cahoots before the Book of Mormon was published. But it might be worth the thought experiment to see which of the competing theories explains the evidence best. First off, we have the theory posited historically from the Mormon side, which is pretty open and shut. From this theory's perspective, Joe and Rigdon didn't know each other until late 1830, and Rigdon was completely oblivious about the burgeoning religion in the Book of Mormon until October of 1830. His friend, Parley P. Pratt, brought the book and a missionary force to Kirtland, Ohio, to proselyte to Rigdon, and Rigdon, along with his entire congregation of followers, were converted to the truth of the Book of Mormon and the reality that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. Like I said, pretty open and shut from that perspective, and it does serve to explain the present evidence. And, well, honestly, it's the official story represented in the history of the church, and it's what the church teaches today. Now that that theory is out of the way, let's examine the competing theory and see how it stacks up against the claimed Mormon theory in respect to explaining the available evidence. Keep in mind for this examination, this theory proposal has absolutely nothing to do with how accurate the Church or the Book of Mormon is. It is merely an argument positing that Joe and Rigdon knew each other long before the Book of Mormon was published. I can't reiterate that enough. Let's take a dive into hypothetical land for a minute. Put yourself there and consider the human element in the situation. Follow me through this thought process and judge for yourself if it explains the available evidence. Sometime around 1818, Rigdon steals manuscript found from the Patterson and Lambden printing press in Conneaut, Ohio. He works on the manuscript with various tweaks and things to make it unique, but most importantly, he keeps it concealed until 1823. In fall of 1823, Rigdon is working the preaching circuit, going to any church that will have him in the Ohio, New York, and Pennsylvania area, and attending or preaching at many religious revivals in those states during that 5-year period. Joe and Rigdon meet sometime in 1823 when Rigdon is preaching at a revival in Rochester, New York, a mere 33 miles or 1.5 days journey from Joe's hometown Palmyra, where Rochester was the biggest city that was near to Palmyra as well, a trading hub. They instantly click with each other and become friends. Joe may or may not have heard about Rigdon and his Campbellite preaching before this, so he might revere Rigdon as a holy preacher, or they might just be total strangers upon meeting. It doesn't really matter. They get to know each other through various correspondence and devise a plan to start a new Zionist religion. Both of them are quite familiar with the various versions of Christianity that are being preached around the burned over district during this time. One of these versions is a restorationist or Zionist religious sect, which both of them tend to latch onto the tenets of. Rigdon begins to trust Joe enough to share the only copy of manuscript found that exists, and it's in Rigdon's possession. Joe borrows the manuscript that Rigdon has been working on for 5 years and gets a hold of a copy of the late war between the United States and Britain thanks to his buddy and third cousin, Ollie Cowdung, and then proceeds to smash the manuscripts together, adding his own theological convictions and ideals into the mix. Meanwhile, the whole time Joe is in Palmyra, Harmony, or Fayette working on the transcript for the Book of Mormon, Rigdon is tasked with setting up a congregation that would be primed to accepting the Book of Mormon and Mormonism as a whole. Joe holds up his end of the bargain by swindling not-so-smarty Marty Harris to fund his little project and get the Book of Mormon published, and Rigdon holds up his end of the bargain and creates a huge foundation of followers that would agree with anything he said in multiple cities in Ohio. Once 1831 comes along, it's time to implement the plan they've been working on this whole time. Rigdon and Joe connect by way of sending P-Cubed Parley P. Pratt on missions, and then they record in their own stories as if they've never met each other before 1830. For this hypothetical, P-Cubed could know about the plan behind the scene or not. It doesn't too much matter. Regardless, he was a fucking tool of Joe and Hinchpin Rigdon. Anyway, Joe and Rigdon connect through P-Cubed, Ollie, Dick Zibin, and Peter Whitmer, and put their plan into action. Rigdon allows the missionary force to preach a sermon, or maybe a few of them, during his many Ohio congregation gatherings, and everybody in the congregation converts because their leader, Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon, converted to this new theology. Overnight, the membership numbers of the Church of Christ more than double. The plan came to fruition and everything worked as planned. Think about it. Excusing some very minor details, which of these two theories tends to explain the evidence best? Do you think that Sidney Rigdon really had never heard of Joseph Smith before he was confronted with the Book of Mormon in 1830? Or do you think that Joe and Hinchpin Rigdon had planned it all along, and it was finally time to put their plan into action? Which of these two theories explains the evidence best? Now, I understand that I didn't allow an equal amount of time to each of the theories, but that's because the church's reported history is so simple. And, it doesn't require much time to explain it. If you use Occam's razor, the church's reported version is simpler and substantially explains the evidence. But, much like the genesis of planet Earth, the claim that God did it may be simpler than the scientific explanation, and therefore would be selected by Occam's razor, but it's still incorrect. The actual scientific explanation is still inconclusive as a definite explanation for the creation of Earth, or should I say accretion, but it's the best we have, and it's exponentially more complicated than just saying God spoke it into existence. This shows that Occam's razor is not always the best way to attain truth. Well, I think the same goes for the competing theories of the early Mormon church that we're discussing. Positing a conspiracy theory does usually require much more evidence to gain traction, and the relationship that Joe and Rigdon shared is no different. But when we posit the theory that they conspired together to create a megachurch, it seems to explain the evidence way better than just saying God did it, or the missionaries did it with persuasive arguments, even though this directly violates Occam's razor. And it does serve to explain some ancillary evidence that we talk about in episode 14 and 15, connections before 1830 of Joseph and Rigdon. Things that people were saying, people seeing Rigdon in front of the Smith household, all kinds of stuff. So, what really explains the evidence better? All I ask is that you evaluate the evidence and consider both sides. Try to judge which theory explains all of the evidence. Did Sidney Rigdon just become convinced of the truth of the Book of Mormon after a couple weeks of studying, while previously being completely ignorant of it and its author, Joseph Smith? Or conversely, do you think Hinchpin, Rigdon, and Joe had been planning to create a megachurch all along, and this was merely the point in time where they chose to put this phase of their plan into action? You be the judge. So let's move on here. The last line that we read out of the history of the church told us about a man named Dr. Frederick G. Williams. For obvious and simple reasons, we'll come to know him as Freddie G. Willie. This guy had a bit of a turbulent membership in the church. Freddie G. Willie was born in Suffield, Connecticut on October 28, 1787, and was therefore 43 years old when he joined up with the missionary troop on their way out to Missouri. Before he joined up with them, he was practicing medicine, but that really didn't have as much prestige back then as it tends to now. Basically, if somebody back then wanted to be a doctor or practice medicine back then, they just shadowed somebody else that was practicing medicine for a year or two, and then they became a doctor as well. Why the fuck not, right? Medicine back then was just fucked up beyond all understanding of what we call medicine now. To put some perspective on it, Freddie Willie was 12 years old when doctors Craig, Rollins, and Brown basically killed off George Washington. Basically what happened, Washington got a little bit of a cold from working out in the snow for a few days straight and never warming up. Then these three doctors were called to his home. All three of them collectively bloodlet 80 ounces, which made up 40% of Washington's total blood volume, over a single 12-hour period, thinking that it would help. One of the doctors even used a venomous insect known as the Spanish fly to blister Washington's neck to try and draw out the obstruction in his windpipe. It's crazy. Modern day physicians have tried to retroactively diagnose him with strep throat or acute pneumonia or a myriad other illnesses that weren't really helped by removing almost half of the blood in Washington's body. That was the state of medicine in the time that Freddie Willie would have been learning about it. Maybe it was better that he abandoned the profession of medical doctor for a life of following Joe and the Mormon Church. First president of our nation aside, let's talk about the missionaries and their mission specifically for a minute. If we recall the point of the mission, as stated in various revelations that Joe gave to the missionaries, it was to proselyte to the Lamanites, or, they called them Lamanites, they were actually the Native Americans, and bring them to the Word of God, or, get them to join the fold. Well, the missionaries basically had one successful stop during the entire trip, and that was in the Kirtland, Mentor, Ohio area. with Sidney Rigdon. The rest of the mission was a train wreck. Let's review some of their other stops and mishaps. Before getting to Kirtland, they stopped near Buffalo, New York to tarry a few hours with a Native American tribe that P-Cubed called the Cattaraugus Indians. They apparently left 2 copies of the Book of Mormon, but weren't welcomed to stay long and continued their journey after a few hours rest. After that, they headed directly to Mentor, where they stayed for a couple weeks and converted a bunch of people, including Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon. After they had concluded their business there and Freddie G. Willie hitched his wagon to their missionary train, they headed out, aiming themselves toward Jackson County, Missouri. We have a newspaper article from the Painsville Telegraph that was published November 16, 1830, and it seems to encapsulate the attitude of the mission and how it was perceived by the locals while it was happening. I'll just read it in its entirety, as it has a few buzzwords that I want to discuss without taking out of context. The article is titled The Golden Bible. It was published in the Painsville Telegraph in Ohio, November 16th, 1830. And I pull it from the online BYU library, which has a photocopy and a transcript of the article. There will be a link to the article in the show notes. Quoting from the article now. Some 2 or 3 years since, an account was given in the papers of a book purporting to contain new revelations from heaven, having been dug out of the ground in Manchester, Ontario County, New York. The book, it seems, has made its appearance in this vicinity. It contains about 600 octavo pages, which is said to be translated from Egyptian hieroglyphics on metal plates by one Smith, who was enabled to read the characters by instruction from angels. About 2 weeks since, some persons came along here with the book, one of who pretends to have seen angels, and assisted in translating the plates. He proclaims destruction upon the world within a few years, holds forth that the ordinances of the gospel have not been regularly administered since the days of the apostles, till the said Smith and himself commenced the work, and many other marvelous things too numerous to mention. In the neighboring township of Kirtland, we understand that 20 or 30 have been immersed into the new order of things, many of whom had been previously baptized. The name of the person here, who pretends to have a divine mission and to have seen and conversed with angels, is Cowdray. We understand that he is bound for the regions beyond the Mississippi, where he contemplates founding a city of refuge for his followers and converting the Indians under his prophetic authority. End quote. All right, so what were these buzzwords that I mentioned earlier? Well, keep in mind the idea that I've proposed that Joe and Ollie were working on creating this church as a 50-50 split partnership while reviewing these few buzzwords. First off, consider the wording in the phrase, he proclaims destruction upon the world within a few years, holds forth that the ordinances of the gospel have not been regularly administered since the days of the apostle, till the said Smith and himself commenced the work. Think about this for a minute. If Joe were really the one true prophet and Ollie was indeed following his words like they were scripture, do you think that Ollie would have included himself in the work? If he is preaching the words of a prophet, he would probably say something along the lines of, our holy Latter-day Prophet Joseph Smith proclaims that the end is near. He translated an ancient account of Jesus and the Americans written in Egyptian hieroglyphics into a book that restores the ordinances of the one true gospel, which haven't been practiced since the days of the apostles. That's just hypothetically. But the article simply doesn't read that way. The way that it talks about Ollie seeing angels and commencing the work alongside Joe seems to imply the perspective of an even partnership between them, which is possibly the perspective that Ollie was preaching and working from. Keeping that phrasing in mind, let's talk about the next phrase with a similar catchword in it. It says, the name of the person here who pretends to have a divine mission and to have seen and conversed with angels is Cowdray.
Oh, yeah? Well, me and the Lord, we got an understanding.
We're on a mission from God.
So the article tells us about Ollie pretending to have a divine mission and to have personally conversed with angels. It doesn't say one word about Joseph Smith being the prophet or about him being the one that converses with angels. The focus is on Cowdery and Cowdery alone. That seems odd if Joe really was the one that the whole church was focused on and centered around, but that wasn't even the most telling of all the phrases in this article. Consider this sentence. We understand that he is bound for the regions beyond the Mississippi, where he contemplates founding a city of refuge. That's in quotes, so that's what Ollie said, and that's what he called it himself, for his followers, and converting the Indians under his prophetic authority. I mean, a city of refuge, like a Jim Jones, Charles Manson, Marshall Applewhite city of refuge? I mean, I'll come back to that fucked up clue in a minute here, but for now, look at the phrasing, under his prophetic authority. The article didn't change the focus of the person it was talking about from Ollie to Joe at any point. The article is implying that this city of refuge would be led by Ollie's prophetic authority with no mention of Joseph Smith. Keep this in mind. This wasn't written by Ollie or Joe themselves, but it was a local newspaper article. And local newspaper articles tend to capture the prevailing mood around the local area that it publishes to best. If a lot of people there thought that Ollie was the guy talking to Angel Moroni and would be the leader of this city of refuge in the land beyond the Mississippi, then it would make sense that a newspaper article would read the way that this one reads. If the missionaries were there talking nonstop about how awesome Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon are, like missionaries do today, then the article probably would have focused on those things a little bit more. So let's go back and talk about this phrase, a city of refuge. I mean, it says that in the scare quotes in the actual article itself, meaning that's how it was preached by the missionaries. I mean, think about it. A telltale sign of a cult is its pattern of growth and development amidst persecution. A religious cult needs a certain level of persecution in order to attract followers. Friend of the show, David Fitzgerald, made this argument when I had him on for the interview. I mean, Mormonism had just about the perfect level of persecution to thrive, given the society that it flourished in. Well, one main thing that a cult needs to do during its early development is find a place in which it can thrive. This often requires a mass exodus from one region to another. The Manson family, People's Temple, and Heaven's Gate all experienced this same phenomenon. The cult tries to grow, gains a few members, and then comes against enough persecution that it begins to lose followers. Then it has to either move to a new place to consume new resources and souls, or it will be extinguished by the persecution. If I'm not mistaken, Jonestown was moved to 2 new locations before the mass suicide in 1978, and the Manson family had to move 3 times before they could try and instate Helter Skelter with their own version of the Beatles mix album. It's worth pointing out that Mormonism was no different than these cults. Mormonism is further removed from today, and we don't have any photographs of Joseph Smith himself, as opposed to the other cult leaders we talked about. But if we follow that same pattern of growth and development, the genesis of every religious cult seems to conform with it, including Mormonism. Well, the mission that these guys were headed out on was to scout where Zion, the New Jerusalem, would be restored on the American continent. That's because the church was being snuffed out in New York by all the persecution. So an exodus had to be performed out of desperation. So while these missionaries finished their mission out to Independence, Jackson County, Missouri, Hingepin Sidney Rigdon decided to make his trip to Fayette, where Joe was residing, to meet him and offer a landing pad for this exodus. We'll talk about this meetup in a second, but let's finish talking about the missionaries and their failed mission after visiting Kirtland, Ohio. They next went to the Wyandotte Indians in Sandusky, Ohio, and from there continued on to Cincinnati. After unsuccessful proselyting there, they moved on to St. Louis, Missouri, and finally made it to Independence, Missouri, the last American civilization before the Lamanite territory. Given the missionaries' timeline and everything they had and had not accomplished up to this point, they would probably just call it a day and turn around and go back to Fayette. Well, this isn't what happened. This was written by Peter Whitmer Jr. about their arrival in Jackson County, Missouri. There is a dating error in his quote here because we know from P. Cubed and Ollie that they arrived in January of 1831, whereas Peter Whitmer records it as happening in December of 1830. The time discrepancy is of no consequence whatsoever. I pulled this quote from The Rise of Mormonism by H. Michael Marquardt on page 256, and he originally took it from the statement of Peter Whitmer Jr., which is held in the LDS Church archives. Quote, "We came to Independence on the 12th month, on the 13th day of the month. On the 14th day of the month, I began to labor with mine own hands. Brother Oliver and Parley and Frederick started to see the Delaware tribe. In a few days, they came to see me and Brother Ziba, and they declared that the Lamanites received them with great joy. My brethren started again to the Delawares and also to the Shawnee." End quote. So Dick Ziban Peterson and Peter Whitmer made camp in Independence and started working as tailors. The whole time they were working and making money, Ollie P. Cubed and Freddie Willie went to the various Indian reservations that were outside of Independence to preach the word of Joseph. They were visiting various tribes of Shawnee and Delaware Native Americans, but they soon were kicked off the reservations by a man named Richard Cummins because they didn't have a permit to be on that land from the American government. I often say that there are a few things in American history that you need to know about in order to understand the current demographics and general socioeconomic trends. The Civil War is a great place to start, as it was such a formative piece in American history. Lewis and Clark's expedition to the Indian tribes is another great one. The movement of Mormonism under Brigham Young is another massive piece of the puzzle. And of course, the rapid expansion of California during the Gold Rush explains a lot about California's current racial and ethnic diversity. Well, this is one point in Mormon history where those seemingly separate topics momentarily converge. The American government was run by nothing but rich white guys, right? So when one of these rich white guys would do something that was progressive for the expansion of the country, that guy would usually be put in charge of whatever part of the government that he was responsible for in affecting the progression. Well, in order to gain permits to enter the Native American reservations, the missionaries needed to contact the man that was in charge of Indian affairs, residing in St. Louis. This man was none other than General William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And who better to be head of such a government agency? So P. Cubed, Ollie, and the guy who threw them off the reservation, who was Richard Cummins, all wrote letters to General Clark to apply for permits to enter the reservation, or in Richard Cummins' case, to discourage General Clark from giving them the permits. And, they were doing it just in an effort to teach the Indians about Joseph's Jesus coming to America. So this is an excerpt from Ollie's letter to General Clark, pulled from the original William Clark papers held by Kansas State Historical Society in Topeka, Kansas. I pulled this specifically from The Rise of Mormonism by H. Michael Marquardt, page 258. Remember, it was written by Ollie Cowdung Oliver Cowdery himself. Quote, "As I have been appointed by a society of Christians in the state of New York to superintend the establishing missions among the Indians, I doubt not but I shall have the approbation of your honor and a permit for myself and all who may be recommended to me by that society to have free intercourse with the several tribes in establishing schools for the instruction of their children, and also teaching them the Christian religion without intruding or interfering with other missions now established." End quote. So, that's pretty interesting. That's from Ollie himself. The guy mentioned earlier that threw him out of the Indian reservation, Richard Cummins, also wrote to General Clark, and that letter is also extant, ibidem, or in the same place as the previous quote was taken from. "A few days ago, 3 men, all strangers to me, went among the Indians, Shawnees and Delawares. They say for the purpose of preaching to and instructing them in religious matters. They say they are sent by God and must proceed. They have a new revelation with them as their guide in teaching the Indians, which they say was shown to one of their sects in a miraculous way, and that an angel from heaven appeared to one of their men and to 2 others of their sect, and shewed him that the work was from God and much more, etc. I have refused to let them stay or go among the Lamanites unless they first obtain permission from you or some of the officers of the general government who I am bound to obey. I am informed that they intend to apply to you for permission to go among the Indians. If you refuse, then they will go to the Rocky Mountains." End quote. All right. That last line was crazy fucking intense and almost prophetic. This guy was writing this letter 16 years before Brigham Young would take the pioneers across the plains to settle near the Rocky Mountains. This constitutes the first evidence we have of the ultimate grand scheme that Joe and Ollie were working on. The Mormons didn't settle in the Utah Territory just because Brigham Young was leading the handcart company and just felt compelled by the Spirit of God that northern Utah Valley was the right place. Utah was a fallback that Joe and the leaders of the church had been talking about since as early as February 1831, which is when this letter was written to General Clark by Richard Cummins. It's pretty easy to see that the early Mormon church, or at least its first long-distance missionary force in Independence, was experiencing what they would call more persecution from this Richard Cummins guy. Due to this, and possibly some other factors, General Clark never gave the missionaries the clearance to enter the Native American reservations for the purpose of proselyting, and that was the end of their mission. But they hadn't been twiddling their thumbs while these letter exchanges were happening. In fact, they'd been busy with proselyting to the people of Independence and working for a living wage, all in an effort to establish Zion on the border of the Lamanites, where Joe had said it would be all along. Well, according to their own reports, they say that many have come forward and been baptized and converted. However, we have absolutely zero evidence of anybody converting to early Mormonism in Independence, nor evidence of them getting baptized, confirmed, practicing, or even of a congregation starting up there. I would assume that the missionaries were probably just saving a little bit of face when writing letters back to headquarters in Fayette by saying that they had converted a few people. All in all, this mission was an utter failure. The only benefit for the church that arose from this mission was the successful contact of Sidney Rigdon and conversion of himself and his congregates to Mormonism. Like I've argued before, it can be posited that this was the plan all along in Joe and Rigdon's minds, so by that standard, this mission can be considered a complete waste of time and resources. Or was it? Think about it this way. Last episode, we talked about how many fires Ollie was setting and how fucked up the church was in Joe's absence. Hiram Page came up with his own revelation about where Zion would be. The Whitmers and a large number of the congregation didn't believe Joe any longer. Cats were eating dogs, the whole place had gone to shit, and Ollie was responsible for most of it. Well, Joe had just sent this anarchist little recreant Ollie on a mission for almost 7 months. This afforded a major opportunity for Joe to knead this Fayette congregation into the church he had always wanted. He was capable of preaching to this captive audience with no outside voices to call him out on his premium grade bullshit. He could feed his flock whatever he wanted to, and they would either submit and swallow it or leave and be called dissenters and outsiders by everybody still in the church. This little time period also gave some time for Joe and Rigdon to get to know each other better and become pretty good friends in absentia of Ollie being the third wheel. While everything that we've talked about concerning the missionaries was happening, Joe and Rigdon were planning out the church's first official exodus from New York to Kirtland, Ohio. This was a massive move, including somewhere around 70 believing members to be relocated. Think about that for a minute. Joe and his version of Christianity were powerful enough to convince something like 25 families to completely uproot their entire life and move to a whole new state, all in the promise of a more fulfilling life following the one true prophet of God, Joseph Smith. Some of these people traveled as far as 350 miles with nothing but their family and the clothes on their back. You can honestly insert any of the other cult leaders' names in where I said Joseph Smith, and it would invariably describe what happened with that cult at some point in its lifetime. So let's go back in the timeline from where the missionaries were. Let's talk about the logistics of this exodus that the church was about to undergo. Let's shift the focus of the show onto Joe and Rigdon. First off, according to the recorded history in the history of the church, Hinchpin Rigdon had to go up to Fayette to visit Joe and inquire about the book and his theological convictions before Rigdon was completely convinced of the truth of the church. Well, they clicked, and the exodus happened fast. This is quoting from the History of the Church, Volume 1, page 128, written from Joseph's perspective. Quote, "In December, Sidney Rigdon came to inquire of the Lord, and with him came Edward Partridge. The latter was a pattern of piety, and one of the Lord's great men. Shortly after the arrival of these two brethren, thus spake the Lord." End quote. Okay. Here we have a monumental shift in Mormon history. It was like a match made in heaven. This whole time that Joe had been trying to start up the church and fighting Ollie tooth and nail, Joe didn't realize the solution to the problem until it fixed itself. From this moment on, Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon would become Joe's new favorite right-hand man, taking on a special place in Joe's heart and showing Joe just how hard it really had been the whole time he was with Ollie. It took a separation of more than 1,000 miles to clear the fog from before Joseph's eyes. He could finally see clearly. Hinchpin Rigdon officially became the single point in space that the success of the entire church hinged upon, and he was just what Joe needed to keep the church alive. Once these guys hooked up, there was truly no stopping them, and the church could be taken to all new heights. Suddenly, the glass ceiling that was emplaced by the constant struggle for power between Joe and Ollie had finally shattered. Things really start to happen now. The entire timeline has been in place for this monumental shift, and now that we're here, we can reap the rewards of this epic change in the power dynamic. No longer would revelations given by Joe be so mundane and utilitarian. The revelations cranked out from here on will have a very special addition to them. The writing style changes a little bit, and things become much more intense and brimstony. Everything will sound much more urgent with lots of "the end is near and I am the one true God" preaching. The first few verses of the first revelation that Joe and Sidney produced together is in the Book of Commandments, chapter 37. Quote, "Revelation to Joseph and Sidney, given in Fayette, New York, December 1830. I'm quoting this directly. "Listen to the voice of the Lord your God, even Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, whose course is one eternal round, the same today as yesterday and forever. I am Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who was crucified for the sins of the world, even as many as will believe on my name, that they may become the sons of God. Even one in me, as I am in the Father, as the Father is one in me, that we may be one. Behold, verily, verily, I say unto my servant Sidney, I have looked upon thee and thy works. I have heard thy prayers and prepared thee for a greater work. Thou art blessed, for thou shalt do great things. Behold, thou wast sent forth, even as John, to prepare the way before me, and before Elijah which should come, and thou knew it not." End quote. This is the caliber of revelations that we'll be getting most of the time now. Buckle the fuck in, because we're swinging on the Sidney Rigdon hinge pin, and it's gonna be a batshit crazy ride from now on. Quote, "And it shall come to pass that there shall be a great work in the land, even among the Gentiles. For their folly and their abominations shall be made manifest in the eyes of all people. For I am God, and mine arm is not shortened, and I will show miracles, signs, and wonders unto all those who believe on my name. And whoso shall ask it in my name, in faith they shall cast out devils, they shall heal the sick, they shall cause the blind to receive their sight, and the deaf to hear, and the dumb to speak, and the lame to walk. And the time speedily cometh that great things are to be shown forth unto the children of men. But without faith shall not anything be shown forth except desolations upon Babylon, the same which has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." End quote. Do you see it? Can't you almost taste the difference between the dreamer with delusions of grandeur and the fire and brimstone crazy preacher guy? This was a sign of the turning point in the church. This was the first revelation that they gave as a team. I don't think Joe knew what he was getting into when he first teamed up with Hingepin Rigdon, but he's gonna find out, just like all of us will be finding out. First things very first, they needed to move the followers out to Kirtland in the church's first of several exoduses. This is the revelation that was given to Joe and Rigdon, and it's found in the Book of Commandments, chapter 39. Quote, "Revelation to Joseph and Sidney, given in Canandaigua, New York, December 1830. Behold, I say unto you, that it is not expedient in me that ye should translate any more until ye shall go to the Ohio, and this because of the enemy and for your sakes. And again, I say unto you, that ye shall not go until ye have preached my gospel in those parts, and have strengthened up the church whithersoever it is found, and more especially in Colesville. For behold, they pray unto me in much faith. And again, a commandment I give unto the church, that it is expedient in me that they should assemble together at the Ohio, against the time that my servant Oliver shall return unto them. Behold, here is wisdom, and let every man choose for himself until I come. Even so, amen." End quote. So that was it. That was the revelation commanding people to assemble in Ohio. And it closed with a phrase that essentially said, "This is the truth. You guys can either believe it or not. It's your call. You're the ones that are going to burn when Jesus comes back, so I don't care if you follow this commandment or not." Well, quite a few families heeded this revelation, but judging from the phrasing of it and its focus on Colesville, I bet that the congregation out there was a little less willing to move. So they would need a little extra special attention to get them totally convinced to make this exodus. Let's rewind for just a second here, because this was merely the final revelation that Sidney and Joe came up with until they moved out to Kirtland, where things really start to get rolling. The Book of Commandments, chapter 39, started off by saying they wouldn't have any more revelations until they made the move. So this means that there were some crazy revelations happening up to this point. Let's talk about them. And remember that all of this happened in about 2 weeks worth of time during December of 1830. Well, first they came up with another chapter that would be later inserted into the Pearl of Great Price, and it was the story of Enoch. This constitutes chapter 7 of the Book of Moses in the Pricey Pearl, and it's a complete doozy. We'll finish out this episode with reading excerpts from it and discussing the way the doctrine is extracted from that chapter and how it's taught nowadays. But that won't come up for a little while because we still have a lot more to cover today. Not so smarty Marty Harris was known to be a rather wealthy farmer in Palmyra. that's the main reason that Joe seemed to gravitate towards him in the beginning, kind of like bossman Josiah Stowell, Sir Joseph Knight Sr., and plenty of other rich folk that he swindled out of a living wage. Well, Not So Smarty Marty had put his farm in hock to finance publishing the Book of Mormon, and they had officially defaulted on the loan by this point. Lucy Harris, Not So Smarty Marty's wife, had divorced him and taken part of the farm as her own during the divorce proceedings, so Not So Smarty Marty was basically insolvent and headed for bankruptcy, because Joe had sucked him completely dry. Well, Joe and the church couldn't survive much longer without another bankroller to feed off of, until there were enough members, of course, to sustain Joe through tithing alone. Well, Joe had his eye on two different targets. One of these targets was the person that Hinchpin Rigdon brought with him to Fayette to meet Joe, and the other was a resident of Kirtland, Ohio, that Joe would set his sights on upon arrival. Edward Partridge would be Joe's first target. Partridge was the grandson of Massachusetts Congressman Oliver Partridge. Back then, anybody that was in the government tended to be a member of the upper crust, so Edward came from a rich family. Not only that, but he also owned a hat-making factory in Painsville, which was quite successful and made Edward one of the more affluent people in town. Well, the people of Painsville, no doubt spurred by Rigdon as well, asked Edward Partridge to go with Rigdon to investigate Joe and the Book of Mormon, and he was convinced. In fact, so righteous of a man was he that Joe and Rigdon thought it necessary to give him his own personal revelation upon meeting him, which constitutes the Book of Commandments, chapter 38. This is the first 3 verses to hopefully get an idea of what was going on. Quote, "Thus saith the Lord God, the mighty one of Israel, Behold, I say unto you, my servant, Edward, that you are blessed, and your sins are forgiven you, and you are called to preach my gospel as with the voice of a trump, and I will lay my hand upon you by the hand of my servant Sidney, and you shall receive my Spirit, the Holy Ghost, even the Comforter, which shall teach you the peaceable things of the kingdom. And you shall declare it with a loud voice, saying, Hosanna! Blessed be the name of the Most High God! And now this calling and commandment give I unto all men, that as many as shall come before my servants Sidney and Joseph, embracing this calling and commandment, shall be ordained and sent forth to preach the everlasting gospel among the nations, crying repentance, saying, Save yourselves from this untoward generation, and come forth out of the fire, hating even the garment spotted with the flesh." End quote. I mean, come on. Doesn't that just sound like a salesman tactic? I mean, I picture Edward walking into a more liberal Christian church nowadays and wearing a polo, and Joe the salesman comes walking up to him and says something like, "Hey there, buddy, you been working out or something? Man, you got a nice shirt. Oh, did those awesome shoes come from the guy down the street? Looks like they were just tanned yesterday. Hey, Eddie the Party Boy Partridge, you know that your sins are forgiven you, right?" "Yeah, totally, brother. Jesus loves you, man. Your sins are forgiven. You're totally blessed, bro. Man, I gotta tell you, I can totally see you preaching the one true gospel. I'm not just saying that, I promise. It's a job that's only cut out for the best and most righteous of Jesus' followers, and I think you're just right for the job. Now, let's go over and talk about how you're going to support the church once you become a missionary." I'm sorry, we don't take Visa, MasterCard, or personal check. We need your soul and all your possessions. Yeah, no, like all of your possessions, like every single one of them, and your soul too, because we're the one true Church of Christ, while all the others are wrong. No, you don't want to go shop around. What does this look like, a Ponzi scheme or something? This is the one true Church of God, my brother, and you can take it or you can go fuck yourself. Now just sign on the dotted line there, and we're all set. Now get ready for mountains of blessings. I'll head it straight for you, my brother. Okay, well, that might be stretching reality a little bit, but it's what happened in my brain? And it's essentially what happened here. Eddie the Party Boy Partridge was a rich business owner, and his family had ties with political and military figures. This guy was used to rubbing elbows with the upper crust type people, a 19th century Studio 54 goer, if you will, and Joe planned on exploiting that power and money as much as possible. This was pretty much the last revelation that came to Joe and Rigdon while they were still in Fayette. Soon after giving this revelation, they came up with the one we talked about earlier that said they wouldn't receive any more revelations until they made the move to Ohio. But there was one more tiny little revelation that was given. This was given at the January 2nd, 1831 conference of the church, and it makes up the Book of Commandments, chapter 40. We'll just read a few pertinent verses, starting with verse 26, quote, "But if ye are prepared, ye shall not fear, and that ye might escape the power of the enemy, and be gathered unto me a righteous people, without spot and blameless. Wherefore, for this cause I gave unto you the commandment, that ye should go to the Ohio, and there I will give unto you my law, and there you shall be endowed with power from on high, and from thence whomsoever I will shall go forth among all nations, and it shall be told them what they shall do, for I have a great work laid up in store. For Israel shall be saved, and I will lead them whithersoever I will, and no power shall stay my hand. And now I give unto the church in these ports a commandment, that certain men among them shall be appointed, and they shall be appointed by the voice of the church. And they shall look to the poor and the needy, and administer to their relief, that they shall not suffer, and send them forth to the place which I have commanded them. And this shall be their work, to govern the affairs of the property of this church. And they that have farms that cannot be sold, let them be left or rented as seemeth them good. See that all things are preserved, and when men are endowed with power from on high, and are sent forth, all these things shall be gathered unto the bosom of the church. And if ye seek the riches which it is the will of the Father to give unto you, ye shall be the richest of all people, for ye shall have the riches of eternity. And it must needs be that the riches of the earth is mine to give." End quote. So a lot happened in those few verses. Basically, Joe gave the commandment to the rest of the church that they should make the move to Ohio, and his justification is so they can escape the power of the enemy and be gathered unto me, a righteous people. Me meaning God, of course. Earlier we talked about other cult leaders and their necessity to move from their founding location, because people knew what was going on and the locals would, quote unquote, persecute them. Well, this was Joe's version of telling the people to make like a tree and get the fuck out of there, just so they wouldn't succumb to the reasoning of the other non-Mormon locals in New York. The important detail we can't just gloss over is the early groundwork that Joe and Rigdon were setting out for the communistic structure that the church would later embrace. Just look at the phrasing in these few verses, quoting, "And now I give unto the church in these ports a commandment, that certain men among them shall be appointed, and they shall be appointed by the voice of the church," meaning Joseph, of course, "and they shall look to the poor and the needy, and administer to their relief, that they shall not suffer, and send them forth to the place which I have commanded them." That sounds pretty good, right? The people appointed by the church are going to help the poor. "And this shall be their work, to govern the affairs of the property of this church. And they that have farms that cannot be sold, let them be left or rented as seemeth them good. See that all things are preserved, and when men are endowed with power from on high, and are sent forth, all these things shall be gathered unto the bosom of the church." End quote. Look at that for a second. Joe came up with revelations that told people that they would essentially have to give support to the poor and the needy. Sounds pretty great, doesn't it, right? Then it takes a little bit of a turn when it says that these people will be appointed to govern the property of the church, and that will be their work. So Basically, the church is going to ask people to take care of the property-related affairs of the church and won't give them a wage of any sort for doing so, just like today. Then, the revelation goes as far as telling the people that have farms that can't be sold that they should just leave them behind or try to rent them out, because the church is moving to Ohio whether those people are going with it or not. Then the revelation really takes a turn when it says that men are endowed with power from on high. These things, meaning the property, shall be gathered unto the bosom of the church. Meaning that the church will come into possession of all the property that these people are in charge of, with no regard to who actually owns the property. Then the revelation really turns fucking dark when it says, "And if ye seek the riches which it is the will of the Father to give unto you, ye shall be the richest of all the people, for ye shall have riches of eternity. And it must needs be that the riches of the earth is mine to give." So basically, it says that the people that follow this church will have their earthly riches taken away from them and be given riches of eternity in exchange. And that final verse is the most chilling of it all. It must needs be that the riches of the church is mine to give. So Joe will be the one responsible for distributing the riches of the earth to the people that follow the church, because those are his to give. Well, I mean, in this revelation, he was speaking as the mouthpiece of God, but by this point, God, the church, and Joseph Smith are all one fucking entity. Don't get me wrong, this was not the formation of the bishop's storehouse, but it was one small part that set out the foundation for the commune-like, quasi-fascist yet socialist structure that the church would soon be operating on. Well, that pretty much does it for Joe's time in New York, along with Sidney Rigdon. He was basically ready to say, "Sayonara, bitches," mic drop, and bail out of New York like a motherfucker. So the time had come. Joe would be waving good riddance to all of the troubles and frustrations that he had been fighting constantly since day one. All of the persecution from the money diggers, all of the problems with the locals of Palmyra that knew Joe was a fraud, all of the problems in Fayette, all the frustrations that came out of Colesville and his 2 trials there, all of it would soon be forgotten, and Joe would never turn back. He was done with New York, and he had his eye on the next prize, Kirtland, Ohio. I've said a few times that Joe, like these other cult leaders, had to spread to a new area to consume new resources and acquire new souls. Well, Kirtland was the greenest pasture he could access, and it was good and ripe for harvesting. Things are about to get crazy in our timeline, as if they haven't already been crazy enough. The first few things that Joe does once he gets to Kirtland seem to be almost a harbinger of what the rest of his reign would look like. This is reading from History of the Church, Volume 1, page 145. Quote, "The latter part of January, in company with brothers Sidney Rigdon and Edward Partridge, I started with my wife for Kirtland, Ohio, where we arrived about the 1st of February, and were kindly received and welcomed into the house of Brother Newell K. Whitney. My wife and I lived in the family of Brother Whitney several weeks, and received every kindness and attention which could be expected, and especially from Sister Whitney." End quote. Okay, here we have Joe's second rich target of today's episode for exploitation. While Eddie Partyboy Partridge was a good guy to have around, he kind of abandoned his wealth and liquidated his assets in order to become the first bishop of the church in Kirtland. Joe needed an active business to leech off of in order to stay alive. I mean, while those one-time donations are nice to run on for a while, they just aren't sustainable in the way recurring smaller donations are. So Joe decided to parasitically latch onto the Whitney family and moved into the upstairs apartment above Newell Whitney's merchandise shop. The history of the church recounts how Joe and Newell Whitney met in the footnotes, and it seems to be a pretty typical meeting scenario if you're an all-knowing prophet of God. So this footnote starts on page 145 of the History of the Church, Volume 1, and it describes the Whitney story and their initiation into the church. Quote, When Oliver Cowdery and his fellow missionaries came to Kirtland en route to Missouri, the Whitneys were Campbellites, members of Sidney Rigdon's flock. But upon hearing the fullness of the gospel, as preached by those elders, they embraced it. In the Whitney family folklore, the incident of the prophet's arrival at Kirtland is thus related. Now this is quoting the Whitney's family folklore, quote, "About the 1st of February, 1831, a sleigh containing 4 persons drove through the streets of Kirtland and drew up in front of the store of Gilbert and Whitney. One of the men, a young and stalwart personage, alighted, and springing up the steps, walked into the store and to where the junior partner was standing. 'Newell K. Whitney, thou art the man!' he exclaimed, extending his hand cordially, as if to an old familiar acquaintance. 'You have the advantage of me,' replied the merchant, as he mechanically took the proffered hand. 'I could not call you by name, as you have me.' 'I am the prophet Joseph Smith,' said the stranger, smiling. 'You've prayed me here. Now what do you want of me?' End quote. So that's the Whitney family folklore. Whether or not it actually happened like that isn't verifiable, but that's not the point. The point is that Joe had his newest wealthy target honed in, and he was set to leech the Whitneys for everything they had, just like he had done to Not-So-Smarty Marty, and was in the process of doing to Eddie Partyboy Partridge. The local trading hub in Kirtland was known as N.K. Whitney and Company, would soon become the very first bishop's storehouse for the church, and the place where Joe and Emma would live for over 2 years. The next lines in the footnotes here really help to sum up the story and make Joe the perfect fit for the Whitneys, making it an almost sickly symbiotic relationship between them, in which the parasite Joseph definitely got the better end of the deal. Quote, "The prophet, it is said, while in the east, had seen the Whitneys in a vision praying for his coming to Kirtland." End quote. Fucking really? That's the line that Joe fed these people? I mean, that's a pretty cheap salesman tactic. "I saw you driving this horse in my dreams last night. That means God wants you to buy it." The history of the church footnotes continue, quote, "Mother Whitney also tells how on a certain night prior to the advent of Elder Cowdery and his companions, while she and her husband were praying to the Lord to know how they might obtain the gift of the Holy Ghost, which of all things they desired, they saw a vision as of a cloud of glory resting upon their house, and heard a voice from heaven saying, 'Prepare to receive the word of the Lord, for it is coming.' Shortly afterwards, Oliver Cowdery and his associates came with the Book of Mormon and with the message of the restored gospel. Moreover, in further fulfillment of this vision, under the roof tree of the Whitneys, the prophet received a number of the revelations contained in this volume." End quote. Okay, when it says Mother Whitney in that passage, that's referring to Newell K. Whitney's wife, Elizabeth Ann Whitney. She was so hospitable and providing that Joe would call her Mother Whitney. This conveniently gave us our names for Father Newell K. and Mother Elizabeth Ann Whitney. Newell was also called as a bishop in 1832, so calling him Father Whitney has a little bit of double-ended action there. So a father and Mother Whitney take in Joe and 6-month pregnant with twins Emma Smith and pretty much put them up until the church was big enough to support them. Reported in the church history, it's said that the Whitneys had been praying to the Lord to give them a sign, and a few months later, Oliver Cowdery and company came by and preached the word of Joseph to them, which was something that probably happened pretty frequently, especially being so close to the burned-over district, living in Ohio. But this sign and these missionaries were special for some reason. Maybe that reason was because Rigdon knew they were coming and he sort of prepped the Whitneys with little code words for Joe's arrival. I mean, maybe not. We don't really know for sure because we don't have their own commentary or journal entries to rifle through. But it's entirely possible that Rigdon just sort of prepped them for it. Anyway, moving on from the Whitneys specifically, let's talk about what happened once Joe arrived to finally lead these hungry souls to the everlasting feast that was the doctrine of Joe's Mormonism. The History of the Church, Volume 1, continues on page 146. Quote, "The branch of the church in this part of the Lord's vineyard, which had increased to nearly 100 members, were striving to do the will of God, so far as they knew it, though some strange notions and false spirits had crept in among them. With a little caution and some wisdom, I soon assisted the brethren and sisters to overcome them. The plan of common stock, which had existed in what was called the family, whose members generally had embraced the everlasting gospel, was readily abandoned for the more perfect law of the Lord, and the false spirits were easily discerned and rejected by the light of revelation." End quote. All right. Common stock of the family. We've been talking about cults for this entire episode. Those are some fucking red flags. But that passage started off by telling us that the church had grown to almost 1.5 the size of the 3 congregations in New York combined, and it had all happened in Joe's absence. Next, it went on to talk about something that it called the family. Now, when you hear catchphrases like this in the subject matter of religious communes, it becomes very hard to distinguish it apart from a crazy religious cult. That's because it was a crazy religious cult, living in a small demographic area, all following the rule of one primary cult leader, which started out as Sidney Rigdon, and then when Joe came in, he just sort of took over. When it refers to the family, that's talking about the commodities structure that the town devised and lived with. It was a predecessor to the communistic bishop's storehouse, just a Rigdon Campbellite version of it. These people would give a large percentage of their belongings to the family, and then the religious leader, Rigdon at the time, would divvy out the possessions as he saw fit. Well, apparently when Joe rolled, or slayed into town, he saw the structure and said, "You guys are doing it all wrong. It's supposed to be called the Bishop's Storehouse." So the people just adopted that name instead and slapped it onto the front of the N.K. Windy and Company general store, and everybody was happy. Except for Joe, of course. Joe was basically made king shit of town upon his arrival, and the town's commodities were transferred over to him to decide who would receive what. The missionary force for the church was running smoothly, with new people headed out to new places constantly. The people in town liked Joe for the most part, and the ones that didn't were effectively ostracized from their community. The early church was beginning to operate like a well-oiled machine for the first time since its inception, but King Joseph wasn't satisfied. 3 days after he arrived to Kirtland, he gave this asshole revelation, which is found in chapter 43 of the Book of Commandments. Quote, "Hearken, O ye elders of my church, whom I have called. Behold, I give unto you a commandment, that ye shall assemble yourselves together to agree upon my word, and by the prayer of your faith ye shall receive my law. Then ye may know how to govern thy church, and have all things right before me. And I will be your ruler when I come, and behold, I come quickly. And ye shall see that my law is kept. He that receiveth my law, and doeth it, the same is my disciple. And he that saith he receiveth it, and doeth it not, the same is not my disciple, and shall be cast out from among you. For it is not meet that the things which belong to the children of the kingdom should be given to them that are not worthy, or to dogs, or the pearls be cast before swine. And again, it is meet that my servant Joseph Smith should have a house built in which to live and translate." End quote. Yeah, after this town had basically given everything it had to Joseph Smith, he came out with this fucking revelation saying that anybody that follows him is a disciple of Jesus. They all have to agree upon it. And anybody that doesn't is a muddy fucking dog. And then he tops it all off with a single commandment for everybody in town to build him a house, because the apartment above the bishop's storehouse that he was living in free of charge just wasn't good enough for him to live with. What a douche. I mean, Too bad it took the town 3 years to follow this commandment, because Joe and Emma wouldn't move out of that apartment until 1834. But still, what a narcissistic fuckwad, right? As we'll come to see, Joe is never quite satisfied with the size and amenities of his kingdom. He's always trying to expand, improve, and consume more souls during his entire tenure as prophet of the church. There are a lot of times when the church expands and contracts based on what was going on and Joe's reaction to those events, but all in all, Joe was officially riding the gravy train and nothing was gonna derail this bitch for another 13 and a half years. The final thing that happened during this transition period was Ollie and the other missionaries coming back into town. It had been arranged at some point that they would make their way out to Jackson County, Missouri, and while they were there, the church would move from New York to Ohio, and then the missionaries would just come back to Ohio and live there from then on. This happened in the beginning of March 1831, so come springtime 1831, the church was beginning to expand at an alarming rate, making headlines all over, attracting more followers, and of course, even more persecutors, and things were just as Joe wanted them. But this expansion wasn't without a hiccup or two in the form of false prophets, or in this case, a prophetess. What I'm referring to is a woman recorded as Mrs. Hubble. I couldn't find her first name anywhere for some reason. Well, she was a member of the church in Kirtland, and she came forward saying that she had the power of prophecy to rival Joe's power. How dare a woman say that she has powers that are reserved only for the priesthood and the prophet himself? Well, let's see how Joe handled it. Wonder if it'll be something like Hiram Page's revelations. Unfortunately, we don't have the revelations that Mrs. Hubble was giving directly, and as far as my research went, no copy of these prophecies is extant, but we can always read the revelation that Joe gave in response to her revelation and try to tease out what her revelations were about. This is from the Book of Commandments, chapter 45. We aren't going to read the entire thing because there's a lot of usual Joe and Rigdon come to Jesus fluff in there, but there are some operative verses in the chapter that are worth pointing out. There are even some tenets of Mormonism that Joe had to reiterate that the people didn't seem to be following, or else he wouldn't have to point them out again. So let's just take a few verses selected out of this chapter 45. Quote, "O hearken, ye elders of my church, and give ear to the words which I shall speak unto you. For behold, verily, verily, I say unto you, that ye have received a commandment for a law unto my church, through him whom I have appointed unto you, to receive commandments and revelations from my hand. And this ye shall know assuredly, that there is none other appointed unto you to receive commandments and revelations until he be taken, if he abide in me. But verily, verily, I say unto you, that none else shall be appointed unto this gift, except it be through him. For if it be taken from him, he shall not have power, except to appoint another in his stead. And this shall be a law unto you, that ye receive not the teachings of any that shall come before you as revelations or commandments. And this I give unto you, that you may not be deceived, that you may know they are not of me." End quote. So that was 6 verses worth of Joe screaming at everybody to listen to him and ignore anybody that claims to be giving divine revelation from God, because he's the only one ever that can do that, ever. It's like at the end of the epistles in the New Testament that claim to be written by Paul multiple times in the text, and we know that they're fraudulent letters. Well, the same is happening here. Joe is claiming multiple times in the same chapter that he is the only one that can give divine revelations, and anybody else that claims to have those powers is obviously lying or deceived by Satan. It's not the fact that he wrote this that shows he was covering his own ass. It's the fact that he wrote it so many times in reaction to what other people, like this Mrs. Hubble and others, must have been saying about him that shows he was covering his lying ass. But in this same chapter, he didn't skip an opportunity to tell the people to provide for him. Of course, this kind of seems to be a recurring theme lately. Joe starts a revelation with emphatically stating that he is speaking as God's mouthpiece. Then it moves into the meat of the revelation, which is usually a sermon of some kind, and then there are some operative verses couched in between all the Jesus talk shit. Then Joe usually closes with saying that he is totally speaking for the one true God of everything ever, and nobody can refute him, and if they do, they're deceived by Satan, and then he says amen to finish each revelation. Well, like I said, Joe didn't pass up any opportunity to throw in a couple of operative phrases that talked about the church supporting him, so he didn't actually have to work. Here they are in the same revelation he was using to chastise Mrs. Hubble, and anybody who might believe her revelations or believe that revelations can come through a woman to begin with, or anybody other than Joseph for that matter. Quote, "Purge ye out the iniquity which is among you. Sanctify yourselves before me, and if ye desire the glories of the kingdom, appoint ye my servant Joseph, and uphold him before me by the prayer of faith. And again, I say unto you, that if ye desire the mysteries of the kingdom, provide for him food and raiment and whatsoever thing he needeth to accomplish the work, wherewith I have commanded him. And if ye do it not, he shall remain unto them that have received him, that I may reserve unto myself a pure people before me. Again I say, hearken ye elders of my church, whom I have appointed." End quote. Yeah, so we've established this multiple times now, but Joe was a lazy fuck. He just gave commandments to his followers to build a home for him and support him with donations, whether they be money or actual commodities or anything that he needeth. Then he made it a point in almost every one of his early revelations that he was the only person that can receive genuine revelations from God, and anybody else that did was pretending to and was misled by Satan. You really wonder how these people saw him as the one true prophet of God. I mean, he was such a lying fraud, and it's so clear. And I mean, with so many dissenting opinions and other people coming up with revelations using their own means, or seer stones like Joe did, he had to constantly keep a lid on all of them to keep his followers in line behind him. It's fucking crazy. Why did they follow this man? What did he have that made him the be-all, end-all of prophets, that convinced these people that he was spouting truth, when so many of these revelations were given solely to lift Joe up out of his own poverty that he created out of his own apathy towards manual labor? What was the key? When you consider the possible motivations for starting up a religious cult like Joe did, he was sitting in heaven. Maybe that's the key to it. I mean, yes, he did deal with persecution, but this was 19th century American persecution. He was taken into court a few times. He sort of got beat up or occasionally got the shit kicked out of him for trying to steal other men's wives. And then he was tarred and feathered a couple times for skirting the law too many times, or, well, for trying to steal other men's wives. And he eventually was shot after declaring himself king of the world and blowing up a printing press and, stealing other men's wives. If Joe would have lived 600 years earlier during the Crusades, he would have been hung or decapitated without any trial. If he would have been living in Rome or Jerusalem 1800 years before, he would have been crucified like tens of thousands of other blaspheming Jews. If he were living anywhere in Asia during the mid-1200s, he would have raised his small army up against Temujin Genghis Khan and would have been slaughtered like the millions of other people that opposed the Khans. I mean, historically speaking, comparatively, Joe had a pretty easy run in with so-called persecution. It's a good thing he was living in early America with its godless constitution, because if he were doing any of this shit in countries that are inherently theocratic, he wouldn't have made it to 100 followers before he had a very public execution. But let's be fair, Joe brought this upon himself. There were plenty of other religious groups starting up in the same area that didn't experience the same kind of persecution that Joe had to deal with. And that was because the people that started those groups didn't have the baggage of their past life like Joe did. People hated Joe because he was a habitual lying fraud. He would take people for all they were worth and tell them that it was all in the name of finding treasure, whatever it might be. Then he changed that narrative to it being all in the name of the one true religion once he had his book available for all to read and proselyte from. He was rightfully hated for his deceptive ways. Once the people he had burned in the past saw that he was doing the same old tricks with just a new prop, they were sick of the bullshit, no matter how polished it was. That's why they tried to take him to trial and get him convicted of disorderly conduct or fraud or adultery or anything they possibly could to make him go away. When these convictions fell through on bullshit technicalities, the people took matters into their own hands by forming mobs to either chase Joe out of town or just kick the shit out of him. Joe wasn't unique in his ideas or timeline. While the specifics of what he preached may have been unique, the timeline he followed was not. Joe is absolutely no different from the other 3 cult leaders that were brought up in this episode. Joe just made one false step and had his life terminated. If he hadn't blown up the press, or had but refused to turn himself in at the behest of his closest friends and wife, there's really no telling what new heights he could have taken the church to, and who the fuck knows where it would be today. But I guess that's all up to conjecture and ad hoc speculation. Before finishing up the history of this episode, I said that we would talk about the Book of Enoch contained in the Pearl of Great Price and try to address the doctrines that are practiced in today's Mormonism that all rose from this book. To start us off, we need to understand who Enoch was from a biblical perspective. For some reason, when it comes to the Bible prophets, the earlier in history we get, as in like the least removed from Adam we get, the more authentic it is, I guess? Well, Enoch was Noah's great-grandfather, and he apparently lived for 365 years before God took him back up into heaven. Well, Joe and Rigdon apparently had a fascination with the old fucker prophets like Moses, Noah, Adam, and of course Enoch, which was motivation to translate or reveal this book we're about to talk about. The book tells about Enoch's personal interaction with God, speaking with him face to face like God did with Moses. Apparently, this is pretty antithetical to the Bible in general, because in Exodus 33:20 and in the New Testament, John 1:18, it states clearly that no man can see the face of God and live. Apparently Enoch didn't give a fuck about what other people said about God and passed this revelation down to Joe and Rigdon just to enlighten us on the church's eschatology a little bit. The chapter starts out from Enoch's perspective, and he tells us that he's going to teach us something. Great. And he says that it'll be taught as it was from the days of Adam. Then in verse 4 it goes into this, quote, "And I saw the Lord, and he stood before my face, and he talked with me, even as a man talketh with one another, face to face. And he said unto me, Look, and I will show unto thee the world for the space of many generations." End quote. And that's pretty much what happens. Enoch goes on the hardest DMT trip that anybody has ever been on and sees the world through past and future generations, and then talks to God about what is happening with each vision. It's like the most epic Ebenezer Scrooge saga, only the ghosts are God showing Enoch how shitty the world's going to get. Now enters the racism in the Pearl of Great Price. Verse 6 tells about Enoch foreseeing the destruction of the Canaanites at the hand of the Israelites, which this book calls the people of Shum for some reason. Then in verse 8 it says, quote, For behold, the Lord shall curse the land with much heat, and the barrenness thereof shall go forth forever. And there was a blackness came upon all the children of Canaan, that they were despised among all people. End quote. Isn't that sweet? It's so nice. Anybody that has blackness come upon them is despised among all people. I mean, it's just such a heartwarming tenet to include in this horrible goddamn book, isn't it? It doesn't even stop there. We're just getting started. After this, God commands Enoch to go preaching the gospel to everybody in a bunch of lands that it lists off. And obviously, the names of those lands just sort of came out of Joe's mind. And then God tells Enoch to preach baptism and repentance to all of those lands. But of course, one land is excluded, the land of the Canaanites. God explicitly commands Enoch to preach in all the lands except for where the Canaanites dwell. If this is indeed God's plan, he's kind of a dick here, setting them up to fail. First, he condemns these people because Canaan tried to cover his dad's nakedness when he was passed out drunk after the Great Flood, and now God is just setting them up to fail forever because he's commanding his prophet to avoid that land completely when he goes out to proselyte the gospel. Also, one small detail here. God commands Enoch in this dream-like trance to not proselyte to the Canaanites, when they wouldn't even be a thing for 4 more generations. Enoch's great-grandson was Noah, and Canaan was Noah's son. So before the Canaanites were even a thing, God had cursed them with a skin of blackness and told the prophets to avoid the Canaanites and withhold teaching them the gospel. What the fuck kind of dickhead God is this that would set out his ultimate plan to play out like this? Seriously, what the actual fuck, Yahweh? You mad, bro? After this nonsensical racist screed is complete, the revelation goes into even crazier shit. According to verse 13, Enoch was a great battle commander and used the power of God to crush his enemies. Quote, and so great was the faith of Enoch that he led the people of God, and their enemies came to battle against them. And he spake the word of the Lord, and the earth trembled, and the mountains fled, even according to his command, and the rivers of water were turned out of their course, and the roar of the lions was heard out of the wilderness, and all nations feared greatly. So powerful was the word of Enoch, and so great was the power of the language which God had given him. End quote. Apparently, God gave a language to Enoch that made him powerful enough to change the course of rivers, amplify roars of lions to scare everybody, make nations tremble in fear greatly, and make fucking mountains run away. I don't give a fuck how great it is to be a level 85 undead mage running around Orgrimmar. No spell is as cool as the spell that makes a fucking mountain run away in fear. The sheer logistics of that are mind-boggling. How would that even look? And that's not even the craziest part. Verse 14 says, quote, there also came up a land out of the depth of the sea, end quote. Enoch is such a badass that he can scare mountains away, command rivers to change their path, and raise motherfucking Atlantis. I'm not making up one word of this shit. It's all in the current day Pearl of Great Price, Moses chapter 7. Check out my Book of Mormon episode 86 to hear it in all its glory from a voice that might just make you orgasm all over yourself the same way the brown note makes you shit your pants. It's involuntary, but totally worth it, trust me. So let's move on in this insane screed of historical inaccuracy and fantasy world of racism, sentient landmasses, and mythical creatures. We're trying to get current Mormon teachings out of this, and so far, it's just been scattywampus batshit ranting. From verse 18 to 21, it just talks about Enoch creating a great city named Zion and leading them into righteousness. Apparently, there wasn't a single poor person among them, and everybody was super-de-duper righteous, and it was basically the perfect town for anybody to live in, including God himself. Verse 21 tells us the first tenet of doctrine that we're going to try and extract out of this, because this involves the eschatology of Mormonism. Just as a heads up real quick, eschatology means the church's perspective or study of the end times, like the book of Revelation is to normal Christians. Quote, "And it came to pass that the Lord showed unto Enoch all the inhabitants of the earth, and he beheld, and lo, Zion in the process of time was taken up into heaven. And the Lord said unto Enoch, Behold, mine abode forever." End quote. Yes, this means that Zion, the one truly perfect city, was on earth at some point, and God said, I want this place for myself, and literally took it up into heaven until the right time. Instead of, leaving it on earth to be an example of the perfect city throughout all time and antiquity. That would just be great, but no, of course not. God decided he had one success story in his long line of fuck-ups, and he was going to hold it all for himself. That is a dick God. According to this chapter, it's all part of the grand plan that God's cooked up. But as we sit right now, we could sure use a model society that is truly the one perfect society to base the world off of. But no, God wants to keep it in heaven for himself and make his will vaguely known through crazy men that call themselves prophets and ridiculous books like the Bible and the Pearl of Great Price. It's hard to even tease this out of it, because next it goes into another racist screed. Verse 22 reads as follows, quote, "And Enoch also beheld the residue of the people which were the sons of Adam. And they were a mixture of all the seeds of Adam, save it were the seed of Cain. For the seed of Cain were black, and had no place among them." End quote. It's just so offensive standalone that I'm not even going to talk about it. The verse can speak for itself. Next, this chapter goes into describing the power of Satan, and it tells about him holding a chain so great that it veiled the whole face of the earth in darkness. Then apparently Satan maniacally laughs as his angels rejoice. I don't know what the fuck that's about. Then it tells us about the first resurrection. It isn't explicitly called the first resurrection, but it happens during the earth being under the control of Satan. Verse 27 tells us what happens and how. Quote, "And Enoch beheld angels descending out of heaven, bearing testimony of the Father and of the Son, and the Holy Ghost fell on many, and they were caught up by the powers of heaven unto Zion." End quote. So these righteous people will be the first wave of people resurrected during the last days. And angels will literally come down from the sky and rapture these people up to Zion, which is, somewhere in the clouds or some shit. So once this first resurrection happens, Satan has complete reign over the earth, because everybody that's left is evil enough to burn or suffer the wrath of Satan's fiery reign. The next few verses go into a very weird situation. God is pretty much inconsolably crying for the people left on earth to burn. Enoch asks the most logical question possible. You're motherfucking God. Why are you crying like a little bitch for your own goddamn mess? Verse 31 reads, quote, "And thou hast taken Zion to thine own bosom from all thy creations, from all eternity to all eternity. And naught but peace, justice, and truth is the habitation of thy throne. And mercy shall go before thy face and have no end. How is it thou canst weep?" End quote. Enoch here was like, God, you're fucking God. You did all of this. You exist from eternity to all eternity, and you control the entire universe. You can hold every one of your creations in the palm of your hand, and you're the one crying because this plan is so fucked up. God's reply to Enoch is the most petulant and unreasonable temper tantrum I've ever seen attributed to somebody, let alone the God of the universe. But I'm not going to go into it now. I'll just recommend that you read The Pearl of Great Price, Moses chapter 7, to get all the pathetic, childish details of God's reply. You can find the entire text on LDS.org, the church's own website. For now, we're on a mission to try and get some goddamn Mormon doctrine from this stupid fucking book of Enoch. Next, it talks about Enoch seeing Noah building the ark and the floods rushing in and killing every single thing on the entire planet. Verse 44 reads, quote, "And as Enoch saw this, he had a bitterness of soul and wept over his brethren and said unto the heavens, I will refuse to be comforted. But the Lord said unto Enoch, lift up your heart and be glad and look." End quote. Seriously, Enoch is a great fucking guy in this situation, and God is the asshole. God shows Enoch in a vision that the entire planet and every living thing on it will be swallowed up by floods, and Enoch understandably weeps uncontrollably. God just tells him to chill out, and Enoch comes back with, I refuse to be comforted. Understandably so. He just watched every single animal, bird, puppy dog, kitten, and human being alike get swept away in the most horrible of all tragedies. And God was like, just comb your tits, bro. It's no big deal. Fuck that God. If all Satan wants to do is convince me that he doesn't exist, and this God doesn't think twice about killing every single thing on the planet, I think we're better off following Satan and telling that God to go fuck himself. Wow. I keep getting lost in this stupid fucking text of this chapter without actually getting down to the doctrine that we're trying to tease out of the text. So let's soldier on. Verse 47 through 55 talk about Enoch's vision of Jesus coming, and apparently it made him rejoice for some reason. I mean, nothing brings up your mood from seeing the entire world destroyed like watching a man be tortured and killed on a fucking cross. Then, God shows Enoch the actual crucifixion and shit goes down. Verse 56 and 57 read, quote, "And he heard a loud voice, and the heavens were veiled, and all the creations of God mourned, and the earth groaned, and the rocks were rent, and the saints arose, and were crowned at the right hand of the Son of Man, with crowns of glory. And as many of the spirits as were in prison came forth, and stood on the right hand of God, and the remainder were reserved in chains of darkness, until the judgment of the great day." End quote. So that was the biblical resurrection when Jesus was resurrected, and it's in all the Gospels, but specifically this comes from Matthew 27:52 through 53. Apparently all of those zombies that were walking around Israel at the time of the resurrection have ascended to heaven and sit at the right hand of God with crowns of glory. So maybe this is the first resurrection, even though it's not called that in Mormon teaching. I'm not sure. Enoch saw the few that were resurrected and the rest of the people that were reserved in chains of darkness until the judgment of the great day, and asked God the only logical question that a person could ask such a malicious and heartless being in this situation. Verse 58 reads, quote, "And again Enoch wept and cried unto the Lord, saying, when shall the earth rest?" End quote. I mean, that seems logical, right? He's just seen what has happened in the 2,000 years since Adam until Jesus was born and crucified, and he is disgusted and asks a question that any moral being would. Why the fuck is this happening, and when will the madness stop? Of course, God doesn't give any sort of reasonable or definite answer to this completely reasonable question, but rather he says, it'll happen for a while, then I'll come back in the last days when wickedness and vengeance rule the world, and blah, blah, blah. Then God says that everything will pretty much be chaos and reach a breaking point, and then he'll bring about his great plan. Verse 62 reads, quote, "And righteousness will I send down out of heaven, and truth will I send forth out of the earth, to bear testimony of mine only begotten, his resurrection from the dead, yea, and also the resurrection of all men, and righteousness and truth will I cause to sweep the earth as with a flood, to gather out mine elect from the four quarters of the earth, unto a place which I shall prepare, an holy city, that my people may gird up their loins, and be looking forth for the time of my coming. For there shall be my tabernacle, and it shall be called Zion, a new Jerusalem. End quote. So that's God's great plan. When the world reaches a single point of chaos and disparity, God will send forth righteousness and truth like a flood to gather his elect and bring them to Zion? I mean, what the fuck does that mean? And this Zion is actually a physical place on earth that God will sanction just for his elect. That is Jackson County, Missouri, which is why the church owns more of the state of Missouri than Missouri does, because they are buying the New Jerusalem. The next verse is something that every single Mormon looks forward to, and it's talking about Zion, the New Jerusalem, being built upon the American continent so that the earth can be renewed and receive its paradisiacal glory. Verse 64 reads, quote, And there shall be mine abode, and it shall be Zion, which shall come forth out of all the creations which I have made, and for the space of 1,000 years the earth shall rest. End quote. This is an important 1,000 years in the Mormon timeline. They believe that all the baptisms for the dead and genealogy that can't be done before the rapture will all be completed once this happens. They believe that the world will be wiped clean from people that won't accept Mormonism, so that the only people left will be the people that accept the gospel, and all that needs to be done is their earthly covenants, which are baptism, confirmation, and getting their endowments. Well, it's going to be a lot easier to do all of those earthly covenants during this 1,000 years because the billions of people that have lived and died before this time will all be gathered in Jackson County, Missouri in their resurrected form to tell the still living members of the church their name, so that all of their posthumous work can be done for them. And of course, they'll be able to enter the highest levels of the celestial kingdom. So this 1,000 years of paradise will basically be nothing but a millennium of paperwork for everybody that's ever lived on the planet ever. Doesn't that just sound great? A millennium of genealogy paperwork, dunking people and going through the temple hundreds of times per day. Personally, I can't think of a worse hell here or in any other dimension. A millennium of temple sessions. Fuck, just annihilate me, God. I don't want to deal with this repetitive, mind-numbing bullshit. So that pretty much sums up the Mormon idea of eschatology and everything else they believe with all the end times and shit. You may ask, what happens after that 1,000 years of paradise is up? Now, I've heard that there's a final battle between Jesus and Satan will be destroyed, and goodness will finally prevail forever, but I don't know where they pull that teaching from. I'm pretty sure that'll come up sometime, but it didn't show up in this chapter for whatever reason. One of my favorite sayings by believers is milk before meat, or, don't cast pearls before swine. This is why. You have to undergo a lot of indoctrination and shutting off your skeptical or critical thinking side in order for this gobbledygook, nonsensical bullshit to make sense. The teachings in the church are plain and simply fucking crazy, right? And that's even if you don't know how impractical it is that Joseph Smith had some kind of connection to channel the prophets of old, like Enoch and Moses and Abraham. I mean, this is by no means one of the crazier teachings of the church, mind you. This was just the first piece of doctrine that Joe and Hinchpin Rigdon came up with once they officially teamed up in December of 1830. Some of the teachings that we'll get into will seem way crazier than this, especially once we start in on the Brigham Young years. But who knows how long that'll take at this rate. I know that the suspense is killer here, and I really appreciate you guys being so patient with the pace of the timeline. Just keep in mind, the wait will be worth it. Joe is building his house of cards here, and we can't just jump into watching the whole thing crash down without all of the cards being in their proper place. Had a little bit of listener mail to get to. First got an email from Doug, a very short message, which I really appreciated. He said, just listen to Joe the Firefighter. Many thanks for your spot-on observations regarding depression inside the church. It was extremely eye-opening. Well, Doug, with a little bit of an insider perspective, I understand it, and I assume that a lot of people that are members of the church probably can empathize with a lot of the things that I said in that rant. So thanks for sending in the email, Doug. Got in an email from Matt, and he opens up by saying that he's enjoying the podcast, which thank you very much. And he goes on to say, I listened to part of your recent cast with the young woman Caitlin. As someone who has raised 3 teenagers successfully, my reaction was that you forgot your skepticize everything mantra, which we all do to some extent unevenly, depending on our own feelings toward or against a cause, person, or institution. If you make skepticism your credo, if it only applies to those you oppose, you're no better than what you condemn. But again, thanks for your otherwise interesting podcast. I do appreciate you sending in that email, Matt, because I have to be honest, I was a little bit torn about doing the interview with Caitlin. She's been on a couple of other podcasts, and she was on a few before she was on my show. I heard her on No Religion Required and Barroom Atheists, and I got this idea of somebody in my head that might not be completely genuine in what she was talking about, or that there might have been much more to the situation that we are not privy to just as viewers of the situation. And then I heard her on Dogma Debate. And I would recommend checking out the Dogma Debate episode that Caitlin is on, because it's really eye-opening. And then, of course, David Smalley, the host of that show, takes a very skeptical take with it as well. And he ends up calling Caitlin's parents and having an interview with them. Now, while they wouldn't consent to having the interview recorded and aired, he did take notes, and he came back with his report on the notes. And a lot of what he was talking about made a lot of sense, and I was able to piece the puzzle together, and everything just sort of made a lot more sense once I could gain that perspective. So that's why I invited Caitlin to come on, because she seems like the paramount example of what the show is all about. People that transition out of the church have a really hard time. Like, it sucks to transition out of the church. I was lucky and was capable of doing so very smoothly, but there are a lot of people that have a much rougher transition than I did. So hearing a report like this from somebody like that's perspective, it's just, it felt like something that I needed to get out on the air and provide my support for, because I empathize so much with Caitlin. I mean, she has a lot going on in her life, and she is in desperate need of some help. And the secular community banded together and created a safety net for her to fall into, which has, I assume, been of fantastic help for her. I've seen a lot of her Facebook posts recently. She's posting, she's, moving on with life. She has a new place, living in Salt Lake. It looks like she's doing great for herself. And we can all, as a secular movement, say we were responsible for helping out with that, and that was important. We helped somebody in need. If she were to come to the church welfare system with the same sort of situation, coming out of a different faith, the church would throw gobs of money at her. They would set up a place for her to live. They'd get her a job in the church, or, with a member that's in the church that's looking to hire somebody. They would give her enough money, like, with the welfare system to survive off of. I mean, let's be honest. If she went through this same transition with the church, they have a lot more infrastructure and a lot more things that they can provide for her that the secular community simply can't. So whether or not Caitlin's story was genuine, which I personally think it is very genuine, and I appreciate it for all of its ups and downs. It can be set out as an example of what the secular community can accomplish as a whole for somebody that's in need. We don't have to have a multi-billion-dollar multinational religious conglomeration in order to have the structure built up to support somebody that's in need. In fact, we have much less overhead than the Mormon Church does when we help somebody, because we don't have the huge buildings and the huge electric bills and the proselyting campaigns to fund. We don't have to deal with all of that. All we can do is just say, hey, I don't have a lot. Here's $10. Here's $5 here. I know this will help out a little bit. Here you go. It's what I'm capable of doing. So honestly, that's kind of why I felt it necessary to donate to this cause and have Caitlin on, because it felt so symbolic of the secular movement as a whole. And it's something that I wanted to rally behind and I hope that everybody would appreciate. I understand if some people have differing opinions on the interview and how everything went. That's totally okay. We're all free thinkers. We're all skeptical. We can have differing opinions about the same things, but I feel like it was something that I've wanted to support personally. And, that's the beauty of what this show was about. I mean, I try not to take very much of the patronage money for myself. I mean, lately, Patreon has been going to expenses for the show, like buying this new laptop to run the show off of, or to various things with the upkeep and the cost of the show. And if I'm capable of devoting a large chunk of money out of the Patreon to somebody that's in desperate need like this, that's exactly what the show is created for. And no matter what happens with that 1 month worth of donations, guess what? Next month is going to come along with even more money than the last month, and I'm going to be able to apportion more money to another good charity or another good cause that this show is in line with, like Holding Out Help, or like any of the other MIT, Mormons in Transition, any of the other good charities that are working to help Mormons transition out of Mormonism. So honestly, that's what the show was about. That's what I want to do this show for, and why I'm so excited to be able to help people with the work that I am pouring into this podcast. I mean, it's a full-time job, and I'm happy to do it because it allows me to do things that help out people that are in much more need than I am in. So, Matt, I appreciate you sending in the message, and, thanks for making me think about the whole situation more skeptically. I understand where you're coming from, and I just hope you understand where I'm coming from as well. So thanks for sending that in. Got an email in from Sean. Sean was nice enough to offer a little bit of perspective on my question in episode 22. Basically, I said, why was Joe so hated? I've come to some kind of grips with understanding why he was so hated, and because of his con tactics. And, Sean kind of agreed with it here. I'll just read what they said. I think the folks in Colesville had been conned by Joe in likely many different ways over the years. If past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, then Joe likely did not live his life up until then without similar shenanigans. That makes a lot of sense. If he was tried twice for fraud, then he likely committed at least 8 to 10 other acts of similar kind. It really chaps the hide when someone you know to be an unrepentant swindler gets off on a technicality, and then when he starts to preach at the same folks, oh no, he gonna get bitch slapped. So, thank you for sending that in, Sean. I completely agree with you. That's kind of what I've come to understand a lot more about Joseph is, fuck, people hated that guy. He was a premium dick. So yeah, I thoroughly agree with you, Sean. Thanks for sending it in. Got in an email from Justin. He starts off, hey Bryce, first, I love your podcast. I'm from Hawaii, and even though there are a ton of Mormons running around, I know 0 of them personally. With that, I have a question for you. What kinds of questions would you ask a couple of Mormon door knockers? I ask this because they set an appointment with me to come back to. Spread the word, I assume, but I love your input. Well, okay. This is kind of tough because though I've sort of answered this question in the past, but it's worth rehashing. It all depends on what you want the outcome to be. Because honestly, Justin, you can take a very hard line with them right off the bat. They're going to shut down really quickly and know that you're not open to hearing the gospel. They might stay for a while, but nothing you say is going to have any impact on them. And they will never come back, ever. So that's one simple, easy way to get rid of them forever. But if you want to engage in conversation with them, have a good discussion, and find out what they really believe, I would just focus on the Book of Mormon. Because they know a lot about the Book of Mormon. They study it quite a lot. They know the proper sequence of verses and chapters to give people so that they'll feel the Spirit the most, that they'll come to God the most, right? So if you throw them off guard, knowing the Book of Mormon a little bit, it can really open them up quite a lot. If you start talking about, the Book of Mormon is a great book, but, I'm kind of puzzled as to how it came about. I've heard that Joseph Smith sort of, didn't ever translate from the plates themselves. Or no, you can even start off with the church's revelation of, well, I heard that he translated the Book of Mormon using a rock in the hat. I mean, that's something to open up a huge discussion with, and they might not have the apologetics developed to properly defend that point. So it might shut them off, or it might open them up to thinking, oh shit, wow, that's an interesting thought. I never really thought about that. Or just talking about, the logistics of the golden plates, right? So Joseph reported that the plates were 8 inches by 6 inches by 6 inches thick. If you have a set of golden plates that are air gapped a certain millimeter amount, and if you think about it logically, those plates would at very, very minimum be 210 pounds. And Joseph ran through the woods, with those tucked under his arm, and he encountered 3 bad guys and was able to lay him out with 1 or 2 little swings. So, that's really, really crazy. With that, they'll just devolve into saying, well, the Spirit of the Lord was with them, but force them to say that, so that was magic? I mean, God infused Joseph with magic superpowers so that he could get the plates back. And then, even once the plates were back, he never actually translated using the plates themselves. I mean, when he was working with Martin Harris, he supposedly had them in the same room, and Martin Harris working on the other side of a sheet that was tacked up to corner off the room. He could hear chinking on the other side. But other than that, nobody else ever saw the plates. Nobody else ever really said that they saw Joseph Smith translating from the plates themselves. Emma moved them around on a table. No big deal. So what? That just shows that Joseph had a set of something, probably cut out from an old kettle or something like that. And then he bent wire, punched holes in the ends of them and bent wire around. So, I mean, we talk about the 11 witnesses. You have the 8 witnesses that supposedly saw the plates and hefted them, but they didn't give any details and they didn't have any firsthand accounts of it. It's all just a single account that's written by Joseph Smith himself, and then they all signed. You can talk about the 3 witnesses who never actually reported to touch the plates themselves. They saw the engravings thereon, but they were shown it in a spiritual sight. They were shown it, with their stone sight or second sight. So you can just talk about the problems with that, and then bring up Charles Anthon, not so smarty Marty, super study smarty party pooper pal Charlie Anthon, right? You can talk about him and Martin Harris bringing a transcript of the characters that are written on the plates, taking them to this professor at Columbia University in New York, and the guy laughed him out of the office basically because none of the characters on it made any sense. None of them were anything that he's ever recognized before except the scrawlings of a madman, right? So, I mean, there's tons of things just focusing on the Book of Mormon itself that you can deconstruct it with that people, that believing members don't know about, that will engender a lot of conversation. Then, if you want to focus on Joseph Smith himself, talk about the 1826 trial or the 1829 trials in Colesville and South Bainbridge. I mean, there's tons of stuff that Joseph Smith did himself and that completely ignores the Book of Mormon that proves he was a complete fraud. So, I mean, it all comes down to knowing more than the missionaries know, but not tilting your hand and showing what you have until it comes to a breaking point in the conversation. And you can choose where that breaking point is. It just depends on how hard of a stance you choose to take with them. Because as soon as you start showing them that you're not listening or that you know more than they do, then they're gone. They have no reason to listen to you. They've been trained to shut down, and your label is an anti-Mormon, and they no longer care about you. They move on. So all of that to say, I don't know. There's a lot of questions, a lot of things to talk about with them. I would just say, kind of like David Fitzgerald said on the show, don't be a dick. That's really easy. Don't be a dick to them. Try and empathize with them. These guys have been raised up in the church. They were raised to believe that a mission was the true climax of their entire life, that's what they've been working towards so hard, and they're doing the right thing. They're working for God. I mean, don't shoot holes in that. Just talk about the history of the church, and that's something you guys can both, have common ground on and talk about. So, yeah, that's about all I got for you, Justin. Thanks for sending in the email. Got in a Facebook message from Jake. He starts out saying, it's a really interesting story. He's never been Mormon, but he's been, an atheist most of his life. But he's had his fair run-ins with Mormonism, I would say. Basically, it's just compelling as hell. He met and married this chick after knowing her for like 9 months. She was TBM. He held that he's an intellectual atheist, but of course she had this idea in her mind that, he just hasn't found the church yet, and he'll come around, right? So it never happened, and apparently it was a hell of a situation, and ended up in divorce. Luckily, he said, I'd like to end on a positive note. 3 years ago, he started dating somebody seriously. She was Mormon as well. She was okay with my atheism and took my criticism of her church seriously. We would talk all night about church history. It turns out that Joseph Smith was the only rock holding her to the church. I took him down and it all fell. A wise man builds his house on the rock. Unfortunately, Joseph's house is one of cards and the foundation is that of marbles. For those who open their eyes, it's so easy to see, but for those who wander in blindness, glue is their best tool to hold their world up. Wow, that was everything about your message was just fantastic, Jake. I really appreciate you sending it in. I like getting these stories that people send in, their coming out stories or their run-ins with the church. It's really, really fascinating. So thanks for sending that in. Got in another Facebook message from Joel. Joel just... he starts out the message, I'm always hearing you read people's coming out stories, and as a way of catharsis, I would like to share mine. Then he goes through his story here. He grew up not in the Mormon church, but a strict Christian household. And then through various things that were going on in his life and in his mind, he came to these different ideas of what Christianity should be. That there's a pre-existence, that, there's all of these things that Mormonism addresses and Mormonism holds to as their own tenets. Basically, he ended up finding the Mormon church and thinking, oh, wow, I finally found out about this, and it's, it lines up perfectly with my beliefs in the Trinity and in pre-existence and baptisms and all of that, so I should join this church. So basically he decides to go to church with a buddy of his, and he was baptized on his 18th birthday into the church. He said, I felt the church had to be true. It couldn't be a coincidence that what I always believed I found taught in this true church. Confirmation bias blinded me. It's just amazing. So a few months after his baptism, of course, his bishop approached him and said, hey, have you thought about going on a mission at 19? And he hadn't. So the bishop and everybody around him convinced him to go on a church. And 4 months into his 19th year, he found himself at the MTC in the Carlsbad, California mission. he talks about his experiences with the other missionaries and finding out that some of them don't exactly follow the rules. And it was a huge disappointment. It was he felt underprepared going into the MTC because everybody there was, true believing Mormons and had been raised in it, but he was so new to everything. And then it just boggled his mind to find out about the missionaries that didn't follow the missionary tenets, which is quite a lot of them from what I understand. And he goes on to say he kind of had a little bit of a problem on his mission, and when he was 21, his dad passed away. It was devastating. I began to fall into a deep depression, which my faith seemed to give me no solace. I always heard other people say in times of hardship how their faith was such a rock for them. Well, it provided me no help. In fact, I became angry at God and his shitty plan for my life. I felt for all the good I had done and trying to follow his teachings, why was I being punished? What good was being good if this was how my God treats me? Slowly he waned out of the church. He just became apathetic, didn't want to go, so on and so forth. Then he got to a certain point with the church where he began to conclude that it was all a lie and it was a myth that people clung to weakly for strength. And that's kind of how I felt about religion in general for a long time when I was a teenager. But, it seems like kind of something that a lot of people think about the church right when they freshly come out of it. And he said, that's where my beliefs were at until I found your podcast, and still being interested in religion or churches as a subject, I thought, yeah, I'll try it. The Mormon church seemed to have a colorful history from what I remember hearing back when I was a member. So I began to listen, and I quickly wondered how I was fooled so easily by such a lying and corrupt church. The rest of the message is just fantastic and interesting, and it really, I gotta say, I wish you the best of luck, Joe. Honestly, there's a lot more to the world than what church reports and what you think about, and with a limited perspective of church. Really coming out into the world and starting to gain a new perspective on your sexuality and on on atheism or humanism in general, or just your life and how and what life is all about. It's really, really gratifying, and it's something that is a palpable attainment. It's something that you can actually feel better about once you start understanding and learning more and more about reality in general, instead of reality as the church reports it. So, Joel, seriously, good luck to you. Thank you so much for sending in the email. It's really compelling to see messages like this, and it really gives me hope for people that are in the church that are feeling the same things that you are feeling. Like, there is a fucking way out. They can get out. They can create a life for themselves that is actually real and is not marred by the church of it. And just fuck yeah, Joel, keep up the good work, man. Keep it up. You're doing good. You're awesome. I had a couple of new adolescent rebels to thank. We have Aaron, Joel, and Columbia House Holdings. Thank you all very, very much for your contributions to the show. They go a long way to really making sure that the show is perpetuated, and I appreciate you keeping it going. Had a new Nemo apostate to thank. You guys might recognize him as somebody who I just read an email from, but Sean. Sean, thank you very, very much for sending in the email and for your support of the show. What you're doing really helps to make sure that I keep cranking out the show and keep it on time. And, like last month's Patreon, it helps to support a charity or a cause that seems to be in line with what the show is truly about. So thank you for the donations, Sean. Randy is a long-time, well-experienced pilot with a decorated Air Force record. He's been in active combat many times, usually in hostile airspace. He's been caught in unexpected ambushes dozens of times and escaped every one without losing a single plane. When it comes to pilots, few are greater than 05 Lieutenant Colonel Randy. He knows every in and out of every widely used plane by the Air Force and knows how each of them feel with every minor twitch of the controls. When a company releases a new aircraft, they have to do extensive testing on the unit, long before it can ever be accepted into mass production for the Air Force. Well, the newest prototype is up for testing, and the general can think of no better pilot to perform the test flights. Randy suits up and briefs for the mission. It'll be a simple demonstration of the aircraft capabilities with a couple of stress tests for structural integrity evaluation. Randy leaves the briefing room and heads towards the runway to take a look at the new design before jumping into the cockpit. The pictures in the briefing room didn't quite seem right. There's no way that this plane could look so experimental and weird but still function. Randy steps out of the hangar and sees it for the first time. It didn't look real. Maybe it was something out of a comic book or a Michael Bay movie, not sitting in front of him on the runway. It was an engineer's nightmare, but an architect's dream. Every angle was so sharp and acute. The wings were paper thin and were connected seamlessly to a thin, sleek fuselage. The cockpit looked smaller than any Randy had ever seen before, but it was a perfect fit for the slimness of the rest of the aircraft. The body seemed to wrap around what looked like one massive turbine that seemed to stretch the very limits of reality when compared with the rest of the plane. It looked like a robot snake had eaten the largest robot egg it could find. The rear wing was spread out well beyond the width of the cartoonishly large engine and seemed almost as wide as the front wings. The one single question on Randy's mind was, where do they keep the fuel? It dawned on him as soon as he had the thought. This was an electric plane prototype that had been printed on a carbon fiber 3D printer. He'd only heard rumors of their existence until this one was sitting on the runway inviting him to take a ride. Randy grins in anticipation, throws on his helmet, and scales the ladder leading up to the cockpit. He stops to admire all the controls and workmanship. Much like many of the planes that Randy tested in the past, this prototype was still a work in progress. The controls all seemed to be present, but they weren't set in a full dash yet, just mounted on brackets sticking up out of the floor. There were wiring harnesses running all over, and most they didn't even bother to cover with plastic. Needless to say, the plane had curb appeal, but once he really got a solid look, he wasn't quite as confident. Oh well, he's flown much worse before without any issues, and this flight shouldn't be any different. Randy jumps in the seat and does the entire pre-flight checklist. Everything checks out and the tower clears him for systems check. It seems so strange to not have an engine idling behind Randy like usual, but he knows that the power is there when he asks for it. He starts the turbine spinning and caps it at 10% thrust, with the wheels firmly braked on the ground. All systems are checking out. He pumps it up to 25% thrust and the wheels begin to bark with the added power. The turbine is spinning at an unbelievable rate. He gets cleared to launch and lets off the parking brake. He hits it with 100% throttle and the paper-like carbon fiber aircraft takes off like a paper airplane with a JATO rocket strapped to it. Randy's never experienced this kind of response before in all his years as a pilot. It's so light and agile. Every little twitch on the joystick sends the plane into a bank hard enough to feel like he's hit a wall in midair, and yet it's so smooth. With jet engines, you have a bit of lag to deal with, and everything's so bulky and cumbersome. This was a whole new animal, and the possibilities of military uses for the plane started pouring through Randy's mind. They wouldn't know he was coming. He gets the order to fly danger low to see if it can skirt below radar coverage. Randy drops the plane down to a mere 50 feet above the desert plateau and hugs the ground over a 5-mile stretch. Every change in the terrain presented a difficulty with most aircraft, but this one handled every little tug on the stick and seemed to do exactly what Randy asked of it. He received confirmation that he stayed out of radar coverage for the entire stretch, and it made him a bit more confident in the plane's abilities. He couldn't wait to really put it through its paces. He got the order to do the stress tests he was so excited to perform. Multiple consecutive barrel rolls? Check without a problem. G-force test? Higher than any plane he's ever tested. Top speed test? Mock Jesus. Weaving runs, roller coaster from hell. Approaching MMO, not even a bit of aileron flutter. Mock tuck, unable to find even at max power. Every single test he performed, the plane aced without breaking a sweat. One final test, and it's Randy's favorite, the Danger Close Dive Bomb. This is an exercise that starts at 35,000 foot altitude and involves just that, a dive bomb. Only Randy has to wait until he's danger close before turning away from the target, which is usually about 500 feet above it. Randy climbs to the top of the 35,000 feet and aims the nose of the craft straight at the ground, initiating the most epic dive bomb test in the history of the Air Force. He gives her full throttle to see how fast this little lithium-powered demon could go. He gains speed way faster than anticipated. Randy snaps out of the sound barrier within seconds of starting the dive, and he's screaming down the sky, pushing the aircraft harder than it's ever been pushed before. The plane is aimed right at the general's bunker, so he can see just how close the plane can get and still make a successful turn out of the nosedive. The craft gets up to the highest point of atmospheric pressure and speed it was engineered for, but that's all part of the test. The ground is getting closer and closer. Randy sees a warning light illuminate, but there's no dash mounted. The warning light doesn't have a label. Randy rips the plane out of the nosedive before anything bad could happen. He successfully lands the plane and disembarks puzzled, but euphoric with the overall success of the test flight. He told the head engineer that a warning light came on, but upon going back to look at the computer data, the engineer couldn't find a single fault, or any sign that a warning code even occurred. The plane was officially ready for show. That night, Randy got home, and thoughts of the plane were racing through his mind. He thinks of how many times he's been caught in dogfights that this plane could have gotten him out of without taking a single hit. What else could this plane be used for? Stealth operations, no doubt, and, high-profile targets with no warning, that'd be great. The possibilities were piling up in his mind. Then he thought, what about the civilian application for this technology? How about personal aircraft that could use this ultra-efficient electric turbine system to get everybody around faster? Maybe it could be used as a medical transport when precious seconds are the difference between life and death, and, a helicopter ride isn't fast enough. Randy finally went to bed, but wouldn't be able to sleep thinking about everything the plane could be used for, good or bad. The next day, Randy gets a phone call from the general that was observing the tests. He wants him to debut the new aircraft and make a demonstration at the public air show the following weekend. The general even said that the interior of the aircraft would be a little more professional looking by that time as well. With that cherry on top of the deal, Randy excitedly agrees to performing for the crowd. The week passes faster than usual, and Saturday morning rolls around. Randy makes his way to the base in the morning amidst all the civilian spectators that were pouring into the base for the air show. He walks around the air show in uniform and meets and greets a bunch of civilians, and everybody wants selfies with him. After doing this and walking around the show for a while and eating a hot dog, it's finally time for the show. Randy puts on his pilot gear and makes his way to the tarmac where the sleek plane sits, polished and ready for action. He hops into the cockpit and sees that the dash is mounted and all the exposed wires were well concealed behind panels. The plane looks ready for war, and Randy is ready to take it there. Even if this was just, a demonstration for civilians in bleachers. Randy takes off at lightning quick speed, and the crowd gasps with surprise at the agility of the plane. He does a few passes over their heads and brings the plane in for some lower passes. He flies a mere 250 feet above the crowd, and people jump from the high-pitched whirring that the turbine generates. He does a few barrel rolls to please the crowd and even pops some smoke tracers on the end of each wing to make the aerobatics seem even more exciting to watch. It's finally time for the best part of the demonstration, the dive bomb to scare the crowd. Randy's smart, though. He's not going to max out the plane for just a simple public demonstration, so he climbs to an easy 20,000 feet and aims the nose of the plane straight down at the crowd. He slams it into full throttle to make the most out of every one of those 19,500 feet before he would turn up at the last second. The ground is approaching faster and faster, and Randy can begin to see a small speck on the ground that makes up the bleachers the spectators are sitting on. The nose is aimed right at them, because this is going to be the best dive bomb scare Randy has ever done in all of his days at an air show. He looks down at his controls and sees the altimeter hit 10,000 feet, a little over halfway there. The plane keeps gaining more and more speed, and everything feels just like the first time he blasted straight towards the ground at face-numbing speeds earlier that week. 7,500 feet, and a red warning light appears on the dash again. Only this time, it's mounted where it's supposed to be, and it's labeled with an indicator of battery temp. The gauge next to it doesn't read anything out of the normal, so Randy continues his dive. What he doesn't understand is that these battery packs are the one thing that make this plane more dangerous than any jet. Yes, jet fuel burns hot. Not that hot, but hot. When lithium-ion batteries short out, they spontaneously ignite and heat up to 3,500 degrees instantly, burning through anything they touch. The engineers thought the battery pack could hold up to the abuse, but they made a minor miscalculation, and it turned this family fun day trip into a nightmare waiting to happen. Battery number 66 in the line of 100 battery cells shorts out from excessive draw of power and ignites. The explosion from the chemicals combining burns through the protective layers surrounding the other batteries, and they all quickly ignite, turning from bad into worse. Every gauge, every warning light, every possible thing in the cockpit flashes and makes noises to warn of the failure, but it's all too late. The back half of the plane ignites into a fireball, and all electrical operations cut out. The only thing Randy can do now is fly the plane dead stick to its final resting place. The crowd sees the explosion over their heads, aimed straight for them, and the bleachers erupt in screams of terror. Randy knows that the plane will hit the bleachers and annihilate anybody that happens to be nearby, but he can still sluggishly control the plane. That was now effectively an airborne fireball, plummeting to the earth. He pulls back on the joystick as hard as possible to try and bring the plane down in the field behind the bleachers. Randy's adrenal gland dumps all it has into his bloodstream, and time slows to an almost complete stop. Randy looks at the bleachers in front of him. If everything had been going well, this is precisely when he would steer out of the dive, but that wouldn't be happening today. The hard pull of the joystick successfully aims the condemned aircraft into the vacant field behind the bleachers, and Randy realizes he's just saved every single spectator at the cost of his own life. Fire engulfs the cockpit, but Randy knows that everything will be okay. He thinks maybe this is for the best. Maybe the military will realize that it's too dangerous to take this aircraft into active combat, but it could be a great plane to help everybody else in the world. That's when it occurred to him. That's what's important in life. Helping other people, or even sacrificing yourself for the benefit of other humans, not the ability to efficiently kill other humans. James has seen enough. This man was made for Nemo Outer Darkness and didn't deserve to die in such a horrible way. James places Randy's translation talisman in the cockpit, and Randy is captivated by the sight of it. He's able to ignore the pain of the fire engulfing him. He has no interest in the finality of his own life, because he knows he won't survive this crash. All he can focus on is the glowing talisman floating in front of his face. Just as the nose of the plane touches the ground, Randy reaches out and grabs the talisman, and there's nothing but silence. The plane impacts the ground and explodes into a huge lithium-fueled ball of fire. The crowd falls completely silent, knowing that nobody could possibly survive the crash they just witnessed. But nobody would be recovered from the plane crash that day. Welcome to Nemo Outer Darkness as our newest Nemo demon, Randy. Thank you for support, and on a personal note, thanks again for the corona. On a final Patreon note, Judy, I hope to speak with you soon. All right, that's it for Patreon shoutouts. Had a couple of appreciations to give. Thanks a bunch to Matthew the Apostle from the In the Name of God, the podcast, for his help on the pilot jargon and whatnot through that translation story. If you haven't checked out his show, In the Name of God, the podcast, I highly recommend it. It's great. He takes on news stories, and then there's little bits of history sprinkled in there as well. It's a really great show, and it's even clean. He tries to keep it non-explicit for the kids as well. So check out In the Name of God, the podcast. Beyond that, I did have to thank Demonista and put out a huge congratulations to her as well as the show in general. The show's Facebook page just hit 500 likes. On a personal note, there's no possible way that the show could have gotten to this point without Demonista's help. So thank you so much for doing everything that you do on the Facebook page. It's a thriving community if people are constantly liking and sharing and commenting. And just thank you so much for everybody that is contributing to the Facebook page and helping to make it a lively, thriving community. But mostly, thank you so much to Demonista for eliciting this milestone of 500 likes. I never thought that the Facebook page would get there. Beyond that, I had one point of personal vanity to address. I don't oftentimes listen to other shows that I have guest spots on, but okay, that's a fucking lie. I listen to every single one of them. But recently, Amateur Skeptics podcast 139 came out, and I listened to it, and that conversation is way fun to listen to. I didn't realize what was being recorded as we were recording it. I was just bullshitting and talking and having a good time. But I cannot recommend that interview high enough. That was just a good time talking with all of the people at Amateur Skeptics podcast. So I'll leave a link for that in the show notes. I know I already sort of gave a link to it earlier, but that was before the show had actually aired. Well, the show is out now and it's fantastic, so I'd recommend checking it out. Follow the show notes for Amateur Skeptics podcast episode 139. One more thing to address really quickly. The first episode of Doctrine and Covenants on the My Book of Mormon show, where David and I are teaming up to tackle the Doctrine and Covenants, has officially aired. We've recorded another episode and it's in the bank. I'm not sure when it'll come out, but previously that episode has only been available to patrons of his show. However, it is now up and ready for anybody to download. So check out My Book of Mormon podcast, episode 96, Doctrine and Covenants 1 Introduction. It was a lot of fun, and I look forward to tackling this project with David Michael. We're going to have a good fucking time. All right. I think that's all of the housekeeping stuff to talk about here. Next episode is going to be a special edition episode, and it's looking like it'll be a discussion with a listener and supporter of the show. Luckily, these episodes don't take as much time and research, so this will give me some extra time to compile the anniversary episode. I'll just tell you guys right now, that anniversary episode will come out November 12th, and it's gonna be a fucking doozy. I mean, I've been working on it for a little while now, and it's nowhere near ready to go. Taking a month to get it perfected and polished is going to be a huge help. So, I know you guys really like the history episodes and aren't as big of a fan of the special edition episodes because I get a lot less feedback on those. But hang in there with me. This is the wait is really going to be worth it for this anniversary episode. So hopefully next episode is going to be an interview with Daniel, and that's going to be a lot of fun. Yeah, I'm looking forward to both of these episodes coming up really soon, and then we're going to tackle on the next year of this show, and that's it may not have any significance to any of the listeners, but that's a hell of a milestone in my mind. So be looking out for those episodes. And I suppose that's everything for today's episode. I hope to talk at you again here on the Naked Mormonism podcast.